Rogue Knight by Illuviar. 101st, Chapter 27, Part 1. Disclaimer: I do not own Gundam Seed or Star Wars. They belong to their respective copyright owners. This story is not created with commercial aim. I make no money from it. Phase 27. Mandalorian Twilight equals RK equals. Part 1. Behind the Mask. Command Bunker, Royal Palace, Sundari, Mandalore. What a criffing mess, I hissed quietly. We need the data links back up and running. Obi-Wan snapped to one of the on-duty techs in the room. I should have known better, made more contingency plans. A groan escaped my lips and I shook my head in irritation. At that moment, keeping my rising fury in check was all I could do. Kenobi gave me a wary glance, opened his mouth to say something, however he thought better of it and just pointed behind me. The constant presence of the dark side laughed in the back of my head, and it was no longer possible to simply ignore her whispers as if they weren't there. She was taunting me with the truth of all things. I snapped my eyes shut with a grunt as various flashbacks darted through my mind. Suddenly, I was back up in the palace, telling goodbye to the last of our guests, when a sense of foreboding fell around the place. I felt the amusement of the dark side, how eager it was for a bloodshed that was all but imminent. I almost fell to my knees as a vision struck me. For an instant I was back home, kneeling in the grass and cradling Ashara's corpse. It lasted just a heartbeat, and I was back on Mandalore. As Force visions go, this one was quite blunt, let me tell you. Then I was moving, enhancing myself with the Force and using it to locate Bo. As my awareness expanded to cover the palace, I found what was wrong, or so I thought. I could sense half a dozen groups of people moving with a purpose. Their emotions were subdued, almost non-existent, a result of training for those versed in the art of hunting Force adepts. I should know, I've had to deal with a lot of those back in the day, both Republic and Imperial. I've trained some of them too. That shouldn't have been a surprise. Not here, on Mandalore. If there was one place where warriors were still trained in those arts, it would be here. I blinked as my perspective changed. I was sprinting down a long corridor after raising the alarm. Bo was close, coming back after bonding with her basilic. And she was about to run straight into 2 squads worth of the intruders. About the same time, alarms started blaring and all hell broke loose. The laughter of the dark side grew louder, echoing through my mind. For a moment I was able to disregard it as I turned around and looked through the open door of a small medbay built in the bunker. Bo was on a metal table, tended by medics and a medical droid. A respirator unit covered her face, helping her breath. Satine was hovering behind them, just far enough not to be in the way. The Duchess was staring at her sister with a haunted look on her face and muttering quietly under her nose. I looked down, and my wife. Her armor was charred, even melted in places and fused with her skin on the right side of her chest. The medics were busy feeding her Bacta capsules, stimulants and antibiotic, while the droid was cutting her armor out of her. My fury was coiling around me like a living beast. The dark side's laughter was becoming crescendo, doing its best to drive all other thoughts out of my skull. I almost lost my wife again. I grit my teeth. I fought my emotions, which were doing their best to slip the leash I usually had on them, and experienced just a moment of clarity. I wondered at my fury. This was a marriage of convenience. I was fond of Bo at best. It wasn't like I loved the woman. The dark side's laughter changed. Now it was a howl of triumph. Another vision of the past flashed in front of my eyes. It lasted only for a heartbeat, and I was back on Dromund Kaas, listening to my master. The vision was gone then, but Baras's words echoed through my boiling mind. The dark side gives us many gifts, apprentice. His voice echoed through my mind. At least it silenced the laughter for a bit. It hides us from others in its shadows. It allows us to present a mask to the world around us. Baras paused and looked at me. Through alchemy, those who bother though learn the craft can shape their very appearance on a molecular level. It could hide the truth of who they are from both Jedi and Sith, when combined with sufficient skill in concealing their Force signature. That's not the most important feature, is it? I asked then. Baras chuckled in approval and nodded. The dark side sometimes allows us to become the mask we are wearing. It allows us to hide from even ourselves, especially from ourselves. It was my turn to chuckle darkly. Say what you will about Barras, but he earned his place on the Dark Council. No matter what his colleagues said, including my other real master, Zash, there were few people who knew the dark side better than him. I closed my eyes and concentrated. My feelings, my very thoughts, even the dark side, despite its glee at what I was doing, fought me every step of the way as I searched for the moment I put on the mask I've been wearing for years. I glided through my memories until I found the one I was looking for. I was back in the one place my heart called home. Behind me, Marines were busy policing the corpses of the Jedi and Republic commandos who murdered my wife. Their presence was muted, irrelevant. All I really knew then and there was the funeral pyre I built with my own hands. It was blazing with orange flames, which were eagerly consuming rows of woods. On the top of the pyre, the fire danced over Ashara's corpse. This was the Jedi funeral she wanted, and I loathed every moment of it. As the fires slowly consumed her, all I wanted was for the world to burn. To murder the fuck of everyone who had the tiniest connection with my wife's murder. There was just one little problem with my overwhelming desire for vengeance. When all was said and done, I was nearly the top of the list. I stared at the dancing flames. My fury burned much hotter than them. It was almost a physical force that was slowly dragging me over the edge of my sanity. And I didn't care. Vengeance. What else did I have left? The Jedi, their precious Republic, I wanted to see them all gone. I wanted to stand above the corpses of my enemies in the ashes of the Jedi Temple while Coruscant burned. I needed to march there right now and slaughter them all. Yet, I wanted to live long enough so my vengeance would be complete. That thought stopped me cold as my sanity was about to snap, and I was on the verge of losing myself to the dark side. I almost took that last step anyway. The dark side promised me that she could make the pain stop, that it could fill the void where my heart used to be. And it wasn't a lie. Not really. I would fall and I would no longer care. That's what she promised and I knew she could deliver. It was damn tempting. I continued to stare in the flames. I should know better. I knew better. The dark side was a treacherous mistress. Yet as I was going to snap sooner than later. My fury burned too hot to be denied, and I didn't want to deny it anyway. I was eager to throw myself against the Jedi until the sound of combat drowned everything. It's what I wanted, what I craved, and it was going to get me killed sooner than later. My vengeance would remain unfulfilled. Those who engineered Ashara's murder might get away from it. That particular outcome was unthinkable, not something that I could ever allow to happen. I snarled and fought to control my fury, to bring the dark side back under heel. By the time Ashara's pyre had gone out, I've succeeded, more or less. The madness was at bay, for now, though I didn't know how long it would last. I needed some way to preserve long enough to see my vengeance done, so I went through everything I've been taught about the dark side, seeking for a way to keep myself together long enough. Eventually, I remember a certain lesson from Barras, and in the scattered ashes of my murdered wife, I crafted a mask for myself. Then I became that mask. My eyes snapped open, and I was back in the present. The medics were still working on my wife, and they hadn't made much of a progress. I heard Kenobi shouting something as I raised my right hand, concentrated the power of the dark side over my fingertips before I drew my fingers over my face. A veil I didn't remember existed tore asunder and set me free. The pain I felt when I lost Ashara was still here, yet it was lesser, manageable. The void in my chest was smaller, if by no means filled. I could sense a handful of lesser force bonds where my connection with Ashara used to be. One of them, the smallest and most tentative, led to Bo. It was like a shimmering string that I could almost see. Honestly, that left me confused. A part of me was relieved. What I felt right now, it was proof that I could recover from Ashara's death, that I could live again and not simply exist thanks to force-related shenanigans. On the other hand, I was terrified. If I allowed myself to love again and she died, I knew that would drive me straight into the hands of the dark side, and I won't come back. I wouldn't want to. It would be so easy. craft myself another mask, and ensure that my heart couldn't be wrenched out of my heart again. I snorted as a thought came unbidden. Many Sith believed that love was one of the worst things that could happen to us. Some of them thought it was because that emotion could lead to mercy, which for many of my kind was supposed to be the absolutely worst thing we could do. It wasn't until this moment that I finally understood. Mercy had nothing to do with it. We Sith are selfish creatures and love. There were very few things that could break us like a love lost, and none of them were something we could choose for ourselves. Love, it was a weakness of our own making, and losing it, a highway to being consumed by the dark side. It was weapon against us, just like Sidious and company used Padme against Skywalker. I raised a hand and stared at Bo. It would be so easy to just stretch through the Force and stop her heart. It would remove a possible weapon against me. The dark side surged through me in anticipation, eager to obey. I stared at our Force bond. It was so small and fragile, no surprises there, my wife wasn't a Force sensitive. Yet its very existence was surprising. Such bonds didn't form without some kind of emotional attachment, no matter what some Jedi believed. My gaze returned to Bo's broken form, and I wondered what I felt for her. Was it just respect, fondness, and lust? My lips twitched in amusement. I knew I didn't love her, not yet. However, there was the promise for something more, a chance that the void in my chest might be filled. When all is said and done, I'm a selfish man. It should be obvious I was a Sith after all. And right now, with my mask gone, I wanted to feel whole. So I took a chance. Behind me, Obi-Wan was shouting something. I could feel him gathering the Force around him. It didn't matter, not yet. The dark side was around me like a mantle. We were connected on a level I hadn't experienced from before Ashara's murder. I formed a fist with my raised hand and picked up the medics, shoving them away from my wife. Satine gasped and took a step back in fear. Smart girl. A moment later, I was next to Bo and placed my other hand on her chest. With a thought, I tore away the melted parts of her armor, which took away the burned and blackened skin it had fused with, leaving Bo's side a weeping ruin. I felt Obi-Wan try to shove me away using the Force, but his attack merely splashed harmlessly on the cloak of power that was the dark side around me. Ignoring the Jedi Master for the moment, I siphoned the very life out of the medics and transferred that power into Bo, guiding it to heal her. I could sense her injuries, wounds that would have already killed a lesser woman, seal as I poured more and more energy into her body. The burns reversed in front of my eyes. I went deeper, fixing her cooked right lung, using raw power to deal with the fluid gathered in it. Once the internal injuries were fixed, I went back to the surface. My wife's torn side closed up, stopped weeping blood and other fluids. The blackened, dead skin fell from her body. Fried muscle was soon replaced with tender, hale flesh. Another burst of power, and Bo's skin was knitting together, leaving her side no worse than a mild sunburn. Another thought, and the respirator was gently removed. A moment later, Bo gasped as she took a breath for herself. Her eyelids fluttered open, and my wife looked around. "What did you do?" Bo asked in a tired voice. That didn't judge. I glanced at the two shivered mummies that were the medics and left the fall on the floor. I made a choice. I told her the truth. "I see. I did marry a Sith Lord after all." Bo muttered in almost a whisper. "Thank you." "Veil!" Obi-Wan's shout shattered the moment. I sighed and turned around to face the Jedi. He was glaring at me with cold eyes and had an ignited lightsaber in hand. The Jedi Master was backed up by a squad of palace guards who had their blasters pointed at me. "Kenobi!" I shot back. This was going to be a delicate matter to handle if I was to get Obi-Wan on my side. I could feel Satine stiffen behind me. Oh yeah, the Jedi Master was family now. How to play this, I wondered. Bo slowly got off the examination table and dragged herself until she stood next to me while I stared down Kenobi. Yep, that might work. I smiled at the Jedi Master and started talking. 102. Chapter 27. Parts 2 and 3. Phase 27, Mandalorian Twilight. RK equals. Part 2, Unmasked, Command Bunker, Royal Palace, Sundari, Mandalore. Obi-Wan was still trying to wrap his head around how everything could go so wrong so fast. He had a quiet moment with his Satine, his wife, something he still found hard to believe being true. And in the next, alarms were roaring to life, doing their best to deafen everyone in the palace. The announcement that everyone should head towards the underground bunkers that followed were even more concerning. The Jedi felt the Force tremble with the promise of immediate danger and wasted no time doing as instructed after telling his wife that he could feel the danger in the air. Everything went worse just a few minutes later when Obi-Wan sensed the dark side gathering nearby. However, it wasn't until they reached the command bunker that he found out, at least in part, how bad the situation was. An unknown CIS fleet had just jumped in orbit. Both the planetary and primary capital shields were disabled, and the palace itself was under attack, with the targets being the theater shield generators meant as a last-ditch defense. It shouldn't be a surprise that everything went straight to the 9 Corellian hells afterwards. The data links connecting the bunker with the palace above were cut just moments before Vale arrived carrying his grievously wounded wife. Kenobi glanced at the small med center, where a pair of medics were frantically treating Bo-Katan, with Satine hovering behind them. Then his gaze drifted to Vale, and the Jedi Master flinched. He could see the Force shivering as it distorted the air around the Sith, and it wasn't the gentle, soothing feeling of the light side he could feel. It was like the dark side itself was trying to physically manifest around the Sith Lord as the man numbly stared at his wounded wife. Everything Obi-Wan was taught, all his Jedi training beckoned him to draw his blade and cut down the dark sider in front of him. His hand fell on the hilt of his saber, yet Kenobi didn't act. He wasn't sure what exactly happened. How Bo-Katan got hurt. What Obi-Wan knew was that it could have very well been his wife, Satine. Kenobi's eyes darted towards his wife, drinking her appearance. Even around the boiling cauldron of fury, fear and worry that was Vale, Obi-Wan could feel Satine. She was beyond furious too, and scared for her sister. The Jedi Master's attention sprang back to Vale, who was practically engulfed by the dark side. The Force was screaming warnings in the back of Obi-Wan's mind, as if he didn't know the danger they all were in right then. If Vale snapped, Kenobi doubted he would be able to stop him right now, the raw power surrounding the man. It made the Jedi afraid. Even worse, he could almost hear the dark side whispering to him, even if he sensed that most of its attention was centered on Vale. That power, the promise it held. Kenobi shook his head and took an involuntary step back. His eyes hardened, and he drew on the Force, seeking solace in the light side, pulling it around his body as a shield. The moment he did so, a pressure he was unaware of was lifted from his mind. He could feel the Force itself pulsing around him, centered on Vale. The Sith appeared to be engulfed by a hurricane winds made by the dark side itself. The sense of danger spiked, forcing Obi-Wan to draw on as much of the Force as he could in order to protect himself. Obi-Wan tensed, ready for anything, yet his attention was divided between Satine and Vale, who separated Kenobi from his wife. In that moment, all the Jedi wanted was to get Satine somewhere safe, away from the explosion he knew was coming. Vale raised a hand, and Obi-Wan almost drew his blade, yet something stilled his hand. He could feel a part of the dark side's attention shifting towards him as if daring him to make a move. He heard a faint laughter in the back of his head. Then Vale dragged his finger over his face, and the storm of dark side energy collapsed upon itself. It hardened, for a lack of better word, and surrounded the Sith Lord like a mantle. For the first time since meeting Vale, Obi-Wan had sure beyond any shadow of a doubt that the man was a Dark Lord of the Sith. What's more, he knew why the Sith were to be feared. The dark side surrounded Vale like a living cloak, acting like a pet, eager to obey its master. A moment later, it proved it too. Vale raised a hand, and the Force itself trembled as the dark side itself shook in anticipation to be commanded. "Vale, that's enough," Obi-Wan shouted. He could feel that something was about to happen. Whatever Vale was about to do, it was going to change things. The Force's warnings had become a dull scream, shacking his mind. Suddenly, without any warning, the medics were wrenched away from the still form of Bo-Katan. It was a moment later that Kenobi felt Vale's actions through the Force, as if he was watching events unfold with a lag. The Sith strode towards the wounded woman, and Obi-Wan acted on instinct. His arm snapped up, and he used the Force to wrench Vale back. Kenobi's attempt had no effect. His telekinetic pull simply slid over the dark side, cloaking the Sith Lord, as if it was no more tangible than mist trying to impede the progress of a freighter. What followed stunned Obi-Wan with a combination of disbelief and sick fascination. He watched as Vale literally wrenched away the life force of the two medics and used it to heal his wife. Even worse, he could sense the Sith's feelings. Murdering the two men didn't really register to him. It was as if snuffing their lives didn't matter at all. There was not a shred of remorse or regret. All Kenobi could feel coming from the man was satisfaction and relief. The Jedi knew his duty. At that moment, he had a revelation. It was all about this moment. All his training, his life as a Jedi. They led to this place and time. Obi-Wan drew his lightsaber and ignited the azure blade. "Vale!" Kenobi shouted a challenge. The Jedi Master knew what was going to happen, what had to happen. He couldn't allow Vale free rein. He should have acted earlier. Perhaps on Ryloth, certainly on Geonosis. The light side pulsed around him in tandem with his racing heartbeat, and he could sense the darkness around Vale answering in kind. What Obi-Wan knew, right at that moment, was that this was perhaps the last chance he would ever get to stop Vale from dragging the Republic into ever darker, bloodier path. Kenobi. The Sith shot back. Obi-Wan tensed, preparing to meet any attack. The light side apparently agreed, as he drew more and more power in order to protect himself against the inevitable assault. What the Jedi Master didn't expect was for Bo-Katan to drag herself from the examination table and stand beside her husband. Obi-Wan could feel an attack coming, coiling to parry with either blade or the Force. Instead, Vale started talking. =RK equals. Part 3. Between Twilight and Dawn. Command Bunker. Royal Palace. Sundari, Mandalore. "That won't be necessary, Obi-Wan." Vale spoke, and his lips curled in a grim amusement. "Necessary?" Kenobi couldn't help himself after staring at the man incredulously for a few heartbeats. "You just murdered two men in cold blood." "That's one way of putting it," the Sith admitted without any sign of remorse. That only pushed the Jedi's determination even further. He couldn't allow that man to remain in charge of the GAR. Doing so would stain both the Republic and Jedi beyond redemption. The death toll on Geonosis alone. Obi-Wan flinched at that thought. He had felt millions die on that world, and yet did nothing to stop the madness. He couldn't allow such madness to continue. "I did what I had to do to heal my wife." The statement was delivered calmly, without a shred of regret. For a split second, Obi-Wan's eyes flickered to Satine before refocusing on the Sith, something that Vale undoubtedly caught. Kenobi couldn't help it but wonder what would he do if he was in the same position. The Jedi in him knew what was the right answer. The newlywed husband disagreed. Then the Sith bastard smiled as if he knew what Kenobi thought. "What do you expect to happen here, Obi-Wan?" Vale asked. "You have to be stopped." Kenobi answered automatically. The Force was continuing to scream of immense danger, yet the Sith Lord simply stood there, relaxed and smiling. That was throwing the Jedi Master off. That behavior flew in the face of everything he had been taught about the Sith, just as almost everything that Vale usually did. "Stopped?" A curious expression appeared on the Sith Lord's face. "Pray tell, why is that?" the infuriating man asked in a fake innocent tone. "You just drained the life of two people and ask me what's wrong." The words were out before Obi-Wan could think. That damned man was keeping him off balance. Deliberately too, he was sure of it. "If you want to play it like that..." The amusement vanished from Vale's face. "Let's get the unimportant part out first. Legally, I'm set. Diplomatic immunity. Realistically, if anyone believes that I wouldn't do anything within reason to keep my wife alive and happy, then you don't know me at all. If a Mandalorian has a problem with what I just did to heal Bo, they're welcome to challenge me to a single combat and express their grievances. I stand by my actions, and I will gladly face them on an even footing." This time Vale glared back. Obi-Wan was about to offer an angry retort when he felt the guards behind him calm down a bit. He glanced at the armed men who were lowering their blasters. Then it dawned on the Jedi Master. Vale was speaking as much to him as he was to the Mandalorians, and he knew them and their culture better than Kenobi ever did. Further, he saw Bo-Katan giving a grim nod, one of agreement with her husband. While Satine was glaring at the Sith, she chose to remain silent, which was almost worse than a verbal agreement. Suddenly, Obi-Wan found himself the center of attention. He could feel everyone's eyes boring holes in him. That gave the Jedi pause. It took him mere moments to comprehend exactly how he had been outmaneuvered. Vale would have problem with the Mandalorians over what he did, though those would most likely materialize as personal challenges, something the man was going to enjoy. Perhaps not many if the Sith succeeded in becoming Mandalore, and that might very well be a disaster for the Republic and the galaxy as a whole. It was just a feeling coming through the Force. That Vale in a position of power would lead to oceans of spilled blood and burning worlds. That very thought made a frosty hand grip Obi-Wan's spine. "This madness needs to end." Kenobi spoke. "I can't let you throw the galaxy in darkness." "Me? You resident Sith Lord already did that before I arrived." Vale had the audacity to chuckle. "Dooku told you the truth back on Geonosis when the war began. The Republic has been under the control of a Sith for more than a decade." That stopped Obi-Wan cold. He could sense no deception coming from Vale, nor could he believe him. Deception, lies, and half-truths were within a Sith's arsenal. Kenobi gripped his blade more tightly. Part of him screamed that he had to attack, to end it one way or another. Yet there was another part of the man, one that listened and agreed. That was the same part which was grateful to the Sith for the opportunity to marry Satine. It was a selfish part of Obi-Wan's being, one he had been denying for decades. That dissonance left the Jedi torn, confused, and vulnerable. Apparently Vale knew that too. "I understand," the Sith nodded in sympathy. "On one side, you feel obliged to follow the Jedi teachings, to oppose me because I'm an existential threat to the Council's neat, tidy narrative. It's not like that, and you know it," Obi-Wan shot back. His anger was steadily growing as Vale proceeded to twist his words and his very thoughts. "Isn't it? I'm supposed to be the enemy. Yet what have I done since I arrived? I could have left dozens Jedi to be slaughtered during the temple attack. I could have thrown all GAR units on Coruscant against the Jedi after Windu practically committed treason," Vale snapped. It was true. On the face of it, all the Sith did was to prove himself as an ally of the Jedi Order. Yet those same actions were tearing the Jedi from within. Obi-Wan couldn't help but wonder if that wasn't Vale's plan from the start. He was afraid that they all were playing on the man's tune ever since he joined the GAR. "That's one way to look at it. I'll agree that you did a lot for the Jedi, for me." Kenobi paused. "At the same time, you're personally responsible for the current state of the Order, which is getting closer and closer to a civil war. That tends to happen when the Jedi are confronted with reality and not given the opportunity to delude themselves any longer. It usually happened during a galactic war. I can't take credit for your impending civil war, no matter how amusing I find that thought. You can blame the way you have been taught about both the Force and the galaxy at large about that." Vale sounded awfully smug. "I find that hard to believe." Obi-Wan told the truth. "You're walking a path I cannot follow, one that I have to prevent." Vale sounded so convincing, so sincere. Even worse, Obi-Wan could detect no deception. Yet, yes, Vale had a good chance to burn down the Jedi Temple and to even turn the Jedi into hunted outlaws. However, what was happening right now was perhaps worse. The Order was on the verge of tearing itself apart. If that happened, many Jedi might fall. Was that Vale's goal? Unfortunately, there was a part of Obi-Wan that felt that Sith might be correct. Perhaps that was what stayed his hand, so he could listen to the man. "Do I? Perhaps. Then it's a good thing I don't want you to follow me." Vale smirked. "Oh? You want me to kneel then? To swear allegiance to Darth Vale? Or is it vile?" Obi-Wan glared at the infuriating Sith. For all Kenobi knew, Vale was trying to turn him. Unfortunately, there were very few sure things as far as that man was concerned. "Not really. I don't expect you to choose me over the Republic. Perhaps over the Jedi if you ever fully open your eyes." Vale gave him what appeared to be a genuine cheerful smile. "All I ask you to do is to choose her." He pointed at Satine. Kenobi tensed at the obvious threat and was a heartbeat from jumping at the Sith. when Vale gave him a disappointed look. "Oh, get over yourself. I won't be attacking my sister-in-law because you're being an idiot." It was as if Vale was reading his mind. "Again, earlier tonight you became a Mandalorian by marrying my sister." Bo-Katan interrupted them, making everyone look at her. Obi-Wan saw Vale giving her a fond smile and a small nod. The woman stared at the Jedi Master and continued speaking. "Either get over your Jedi hang-ups or solve this like Mandalorian warriors," Bo-Katan snapped. "However, if you chose the criffing Jedi over my sister," she pointed at her husband, "he'll be the least of your problems." She was serious too. Choosing between the woman you love and your duty as a Jedi, Vale must. It's never easy for your kind. And all too easy for you. Obi-Wan snipped back. The Jedi in him didn't want to admit that all he wanted was to be with Satine. Only his sense of duty kept him from doing so. True, during the Great War I chose love and never regretted it. I made the same choice tonight, and I would never regret it. At that, Bo-Katan's lips curled into a smile. Even Satine gave the Sith a nod of approval, despite him murdering 2 of her men just a few minutes ago. If he had to be honest to himself, what Obi-Wan wanted to do was obvious. He wanted to choose Satine, no matter what. That's when he truly comprehended why the Jedi were forbidden to marry. Forbidden to love. For doing so, shattered their loyalties and left them drifting. At that moment, Kenobi could feel smug amusement practically radiating from Vale. It was infuriating. "It's a very good thing I'm not asking you to become a Sith, nor to turn on the Republic or the Jedi." The Sith Lord sounded awfully happy and pleased with himself, something that was ringing all sorts of alarm bells within Obi-Wan's mind. "You're still a Gyar general, sworn to protect the Republic, are you not? As it happens, so am I, as you're well aware. If I wanted to criff up the Republic, all I had to do was lose the space battle above Geonosis. With the other side under competent leadership, it would have been all too easy to engineer such a disaster." He couldn't rebuff those arguments. A loss above Geonosis would have been a strategic setback from which the Republic would have been unlikely to recover. Yet the issue was never Vale's skills as a general. You might very well lead the Republic to victory. At what cost, I wonder? How many worlds will burn? How many will die because of your tactics and strategies? That was the crux of the problem. Vale was all too willing, eager even, to spill blood and wreak destruction. "More than you fear," Vale admitted. "Still, it would be much better outcome than a separatist victory. Besides, you missed the most important point, Obi-Wan." "What is that?" The Jedi was almost afraid to ask. Under my command, the enemy would be doing most of the dying instead of loyal, innocent Republic civilians. When you talk about galactic wars, that's the best you could ask for. Besides, I think it's high time to get off your high horse. Vale glared at him. "Do I have to remind you of Christophsis, the most populated world that saw army-scale clashes since the war began with an enemy blockade too? That stopped Obi-Wan cold. He spent the first months of the war on that world and presided over a bloodbath of incomprehensible magnitude. Between open warfare, destroyed infrastructure, the blockade in orbit, logistic disruptions and disease, at least 1 trillion of the locals died before the CIS forces were forced to either surrender or withdrawn. Obi-Wan still had nightmares about what happened on that world, and he would carry them to his dying breath. That's what I'm trying to prevent." Obi-Wan could no longer keep his anger in check and shouted, "If you're left on your own devices, we'll see the same madness on dozens, perhaps hundreds of worlds. That's going to happen with or without me. This war will decide the fate of the galaxy, Obi-Wan. Neither side can accept anything but victory." The CIS made sure of that. After the shenanigans they pulled, their leaders need to win or it would be their heads on the chopping block. Victory will give them everything they ever wanted, and most of them won't hesitate to see the galaxy burn in order to win. "So we need to stoop down to their level. Is that your plan?" Vale gave him an exasperated look. "Do I look like a criffing imbecile? The Confederacy criffed by the numbers with their terror attacks. Responding in kind would simply stiffen their resolve. Yet you did so on Geonosis. I felt all those people die, Vale. If I wanted to respond in kind, I would have burned every major settlement on that planet and then poisoned the surface. What I did was the bare minimum to knock Geonosis out of the war for the next few years without wasting troops and fleet assets on an occupation we can't really afford. Unfortunately, doing so required wrecking major portions of the infrastructure and, as a side effect, either directly or indirectly, killing millions. That's unacceptable. Obi-Wan all but roared, his composure shattering. If you believe so, I'll accept your resignation from the GAR right here and now. We aren't playing games, Obi-Wan. We aren't peacekeepers seeking a peaceful resolution of a minor conflict. We're soldiers who have to do what's necessary for the survival of the Republic. Because if we flinch, if we prosecute this conflict with silk gloves, then the Confederacy will win. We both know if that happens, they will unleash a reign of terror upon the galaxy, the likes of which no one has seen in at least a millennium. Equals RK equals. I looked the Jedi Master in the eyes, hoping that my gambit was going to work. Ever since I started speaking, I've been doing my best to keep him off balance. Distracted, torn between his heart's desire and duty as a Jedi. However, that's not what I want. I spoke quietly, making my tone as earnest as I could. I don't want you as an enemy, Obi-Wan, nor as a minion. I need you as a friend, as an advisor, who might keep me from going too far. That was even true, from certain point of view. However, I didn't add that no one was going to keep me from doing what I deemed fit in order to prepare the galaxy for the Vong and whatever else might decide to come knocking on the door. Judging by Obi-Wan's expression, that threw him for a loop. You know I've been against what happened on Geonosis from day one, Kenobi actually growled. I might have been pushing him a bit too far, too fast. The alternatives were to either burn the whole world, occupy the damn dustbin, or invade it again next year. Neither of those options were viable alternatives, I repeated. I tried to be reasonable, though as the conversation progressed, the need to slap Kenobi upside the head, repeatedly, with something heavy, was becoming hard to resist. There was not a single Jedi or other GAR officer who presented me with a single viable alternative. We both know that most of the GAR personnel would have loved nothing more than seeing Geonosis burn instead of invading the damn place for a second time. We have a different definition on what's acceptable. Obi-Wan grumbled. That's rich. I thought that after Ryloth you were done with the peacekeeper mentality. I snorted. Don't twist my words. Obi-Wan glared at me. Fine, no more games. Obi-Wan, you have to make a choice. The Jedi, the Republic, Mandalore, your wife. Unless you decide, you will be torn apart between your duty and your heart. There was a long moment of silence before Kenobi answered. You didn't mention yourself, Vale. For the first time since we began our verbal spar, Obi-Wan looked relaxed, almost serene. The force surrounding him settled down as his emotions subdued. I'm doing what I can for Mandalore, though it might not be enough. If the situation gets sufficiently criffed up, I might be forced to order the orbital bombardment of this world, so the Death Watch and the CIS wouldn't be able to us it as a base of operations. I'll see the Republic to a victory in this war because any other alternative is much worse in comparison. I told the truth. The Republic? Or whatever replaces it. I don't want to rule the galaxy as an emperor, if that's what you ask. Another truth. Now, being in charge of the army and keeping whoever ran the galaxy from messing up my plans for the future, that was something quite different. Besides, the plan to turn the Republic into a galactic empire wasn't mine. I merely entertained the idea of co-opting it once Sidious was dealt with. You actually believe that, don't you? Obi-Wan asked in surprise. I've ran planets before. That was enough of a pain in the ass to dissuade me from any ideas of galactic domination. Besides, it was much better to be the power behind the throne. That way, some other sucker could deal with the day-to-day shenanigans of running the whole bloody galaxy. He's right, you know. Actually ruling Mandalore is anything but pleasant or fun. Satine decided to add her 2 credits. It's a duty, though one I don't relish. Listen to your wife. I nodded, earning myself a pair of dirty looks from the Ken Obis. Aren't they cute? Bo snorted, lowering the tension a bit. Indeed, dear, let's cut to the chase. Kenobi, I don't want to turn you into a bloodthirsty Sith, nor am I going to send you to burn down the Jedi Temple, corrupt younglings, or do something else idiotic. I conveniently didn't mention that if there was another Windu-type stunt, things would get ugly, either because I would lose my patience with the Jedi in general, or because Palpy would be able to use such an accident to clean up house earlier than planned. "I must be mad," Obi-Wan muttered. "The path you're walking?" He shook his head. "I don't know if it's one I could follow." Huh. Wasn't that a reversal? If it's a path that any Jedi could follow. Kenobi continued and looked at his wife with a pained expression on his face. "However, I can't walk away from Satine. Not even for the Order," he added quietly. I smiled. That was all I wanted for now. The rest would follow, probably sooner than later. "Let's hope they won't force you to choose." I gave Kenobi a reassuring smile, even if I didn't believe this would be the case. "We both know that is a forlorn hope, after what Anakin did. Your former apprentice acted as an idiot. We both know that there was no antidote on Geonosis. The whole ploy was aimed at discrediting him and Amidala. If that mess is mishandled even further, it could easily lead to his fall, which was the point." I sighed. I still could hardly believe that Anakin fell for such an obvious ploy. Neither the Separatist leadership nor the Sith actually in charge wanted Padme to recover. She had been a thorn in their side for more than a decade. Breaking Skywalker might very well be a bonus to taking out the former queen instead of the primary goal of that particular operation. A grim chuckle escaped Obi-Wan's lips. Anakin and Padme proved that a Jedi marrying is a mistake, yet I did it anyway, and I don't regret it. Kenobi lowered his lightsaber. "I should be attacking you with everything I am. I should be doing my best to rid the galaxy from an enemy of the Jedi Order." His anguish was delicious. It reminded me why making Jedi fall was so much fun, even if doing so wasn't on the agenda. "Ah, even if I was an enemy of the Jedi, am I your enemy?" I smiled. "All I want is the freedom to live my life as I see fit beside my wife. However, in order to do that, this war has to be won. Decisively. Through victory thy chains are broken," Kenobi muttered, surprising me. Huh. He's been reading on the Sith of my era and might be starting to understand where I was coming from. I was sure of it. That's the point, Obi-Wan, at least for those Sith who haven't allowed the dark side to consume them. Passion, conflict, power, strength, they're all means to an end. Assets that gives us victory, and thus the Force frees us. I smiled. It sounds so simple. Bo stated and gave me a questioning look. Of course, it's never that simple. Or perhaps it is, and most people overlook it because of that. While I am a master of the dark side, that by itself wouldn't guarantee me a future with you. Only a victory in this war would do so, and I will do anything I have to in order to achieve it. I turned my attention back to the Jedi. "That's why I want you by my side, as both a comrade in arms and advisor. Help me end this madness, Obi-Wan." I repeated my proposition and threw back his words at him. He wanted to end the conflict, let him help me do it then. Though I carefully avoided certain snags we would have to face, it's true I wanted the war over without destroying too much infrastructure. Doing so would make preparing for the Vong easier. Unfortunately, I couldn't allow the conflict to simply be over before I was in a reasonably secure position to survive not only a direct confrontation with Sidious, but dealing with whatever contingencies he had in place. Because if there was something I knew about Sith, someone in Palpy's shoes would have backup plans to see as much of the galaxy burn as possible if he fucked up and got himself killed. However, for the time being, Kenobi didn't need to know any of that. "Someone must keep you from causing too much trouble." The Jedi Master sighed and deactivated his saber. His anguish flickered and disappeared, replaced by acceptance and then affection when he turned his gaze upon his wife. "Live to enjoy a honeymoon with Satine. I'm proud of you." I beamed at Kenobi. We still might make a proper Mandalorian out of him. Next to me, Bo sighed in relief and smiled. Well, now Obi-Wan was on track, and if I could keep myself from criffing up too much, he would be firmly on my side when it was time for the endgame. 103rd, Chapter 27, Parts 4 and 5. Phase 27, Mandalorian Twilight, =RK=. Part 4, Eclipse, CIC Republic Cruiser Chimera, high orbit above Mandalore. Gilad Pelion was in his domain. The CIC was a hive of activity, as commando units augmenting the Mandalorian authorities raided Death Watch criminal enterprises all over the world below them. The operation was coordinated from the Chimera, with the Embassy and the Security Service HQ in Sundari acting as secondary C and C centers. While he had people to do the actual coordination, both intel operatives and GAR officers from the ground ponder contingent upon his ships, the Commodore kept a close eye on the situation, though most of his attention was concentrated on the enemy Navy elements in system. So far, neither the CIS battle group or the small Death Watch flotilla had made any suspicious move, and they both kept their positions, above Concordia and between the moon and the planet itself. Frankly, Pelion didn't really expect much problems from them, especially when the SEP Command dreadnought left a few days ago, when it was recalled along with the enemy commander. Or at least that's what the intel folks figured out. It was another confirmation about the apparent upheaval among the enemy leaderships, something that was hopefully a good thing. Any delay between now and the next major CIS offensive meant less time before the next major flight of ships was completed in the various Republic shipyards. Less time before the enemy would lose the temporary advantage they would be gaining shortly. The Commodore returned his attention to the datapad he had in hand and skimmed the reports in it. They more or less summarized the strategic situation. In short, in the last few months, GAR had performed excellently, gaining 2 major strategic victories, which in turn allowed both the Navy and ground ponders to stabilize their positions across the galaxy. Frankly, those victories were vital, because the situation was going to get worse before it improved. It was all about economy and logistics, something that when combined with the enemy's strategic surprise at the start of the war, was going to bite everyone in the Republic on the ass. When all was said and done, while the Republic had larger economy, it meant little until it was transferred to war footing. That was the short-term case anyway. After all, it took at least a year to complete a proper capital ship. Usually year and a half, perhaps even 2 years for most cruisers. And that was without any bottlenecks in either resource appropriation, component manufacture, and there related the enemy on a war footing when the hostilities started. It was a miracle that the Separatists simply didn't overwhelm the Republic in the first months by going after the major political and industrial centers. Even now, a little more than a year after the conflict began, the situation was grim. The GAR scored some outstanding victories that shifted the initiative and strategic situation. Unfortunately, despite that, the economic realities were about to rear their ugly heads, and soon. Simply put, most capital ships that the CIS laid when the conflict began would be ready before the same was true about the Republic. That would very soon give them a strategic advantage and allow them to regain the initiative by launching one or more major offensives. Heavily reinforce various theaters where both sides were stalemated too. It would be one of the best chances the enemy would have in winning the war, if they could cause enough damage before the Republic's own construction came online. What rubbed Gilad and most GAR commanders wrong was the fact that after the victory at Geonosis, they simply lacked the assets to launch another major offensive before the enemy was ready. Oh, he knew that there were at least a few large raiding forces doing their best to wreak havoc on the enemy logistics, combined with the efforts of various special forces units inserted behind enemy lines. Yet the CIS did respond in kind, and he doubted that any side would be gaining much advantage that way. No, the Republic armed forces were in for a few very interesting months. The only silver lining was that if they could hold the line and avoid suffering catastrophic losses, soon enough the advantage would shift in their favor. Then again, what was that saying? If wishes were speeders? Or was it starfighters? Gilad shrugged and marked the overall strategic overview as read. There was nothing new in there, which at least meant no bad news. Next, he checked the situation on the ground again. Everything was going more or less according to plan, though there were some locations where resistance was heavier than expected and things were getting bloody. Unfortunately, most of the troubles were in places where orbital support was impractical, and for the moment, sending regular troops was out of the question. The current intervention was explosive enough without sending the cavalry. Ironically, this was the night the general was getting married for the local ruler's sister, and if the scuttlebutt was correct, General Kenobi was doing the same with the Duchess herself. That at least more or less guaranteed that Mandalore was for some fun times in the next few days. There were few things screaming political alliance more loudly than marriages after all. In fact, the ongoing dual weddings were the primary reason why Pelion's squadron was on high alert, with Vale's surprises on standby. No one really believed that the Death Watch would go quietly in the night. The only question was, what exactly were they going to do to ruin everyone's day? There was a long list of contingencies prepared for precisely that outcome. Multiple new contacts. 4 light seconds out between us and the hostile one, the sensor operator shouted, "Identify." Pelion snapped an order without thinking and turned around to look at the main tactical plot. Criff. He added a moment later, once the large cluster of grey dots registered. Multiple power spikes were being targeted. Profiles match CIS units, multiple munificence and command dreadnoughts. Evasive maneuvers, launch all small craft, target the closest munificence for missile strikes, comms contingency purple, release Guardian in automatic mode. "We're being jammed. Long-range comms are out," the comm operator stated a moment later. "Purple one, execute," the Commodore added after a split-second delay. "Contact our hosts and coordinate with them. We'll need their help." He knew that within moments, one of the escorting frigates was going to go into hyperspace and call the cavalry. Then all 9 Corellian hells were going to get loose. The plot shifted. The grey icons turned into bright red color. 2 small windows appeared next to the swarm, indicating force composition. 100 munificence and counting, plus at least 4 command dreadnoughts. It was a full separatist fleet, all right. Probably part of their strategic reserve, if not most of it. Acting this bold probably meant that the Confederates would be ready to jump back on the offensive a bit sooner than the intel types expected. Not good at all, but all Pelion was really interested in right now was keeping his forces more or less intact until Vale's ace in the hole arrived. The plot blinked as a real swarm of angry red dots left the enemy fleet and headed toward his battle group. "We're in contact with TF-1, the comm operator announced. That was the closest Mandalorian cruiser group, 4 Keldable Flight 1 cruisers and 12 Crusader-class corvettes. The other friendly group on this side of the planet, TF-2, made of 5 more cruisers and 10 escorts, was right above the capital of Sundari, which almost below them due to the planetary rotation. It would be in effective weapons range of the enemy within the hour, if the newcomers didn't shift position. Realistically, just a few minutes if they could take out the friendly forces in the area. TF-1 will be taking position between us and the capital. They report no contact with the Royal Palace. Try to raise Generals Vale or Kenobi. No joy, we're detecting ground-side jamming from the palace area. Deploy QRF to Sundari, there to secure the generals. Shift orbit and bring us above the capital. Coordinate our movements with the Mandalorians. Status change. Hostile 1 and the DW squadron are moving. Calculating heading. As this was going on, Pelion's eyes never left the plot. 163 munificence and 5 command cruisers. TF-1 actual is in contact with TF-3. They will be executing 2 hyperspace jumps and hit the enemy from behind. TF-3 was the third and final loyalist part of the Mandalorian defense fleet. 4 more cruisers and 11 corvettes. On paper, that combined with the defense satellites should have been enough. The Keldables were supposed to be formidable ships, and the planned Block 2 upgrade would make them at least equal to a Venator. There even were whispers among the intel agents on board that Mandal Motors had plans for a Block 3 that would be a partial rebuild with enough firepower and defenses to rival the Star Destroyer prototypes Kuat was currently playing with. Unfortunately, the current iteration of the Keldable cruisers was simply put an inferior piece of hardware, primary because the Mandalorian defense fleet never received the funding to bring them up to spec. RK equals. Part 5, Twilight and Bridge, CIS command ship Deathbringer, between Mandalore and Concordia. General Grievous narrowed his eyes at the tactical display once it refreshed with the data from the sensors. 3 clusters of closely knit icons appeared near each other, designating the expected enemy forces. No surprises there. For once, the intel appeared to be correct. There had to be another group of the Mandalorian fleet on the other side of the planet, but they weren't of immediate concern. If everything was going according to plan, Deathwatch operatives and CIS agents on the ground should be assaulting the capital's shield generators, while others went after the planetary shield itself. Even if they were unsuccessful, the mere threat would force the enemy fleet assets to converge above Sundari in order to protect the domed city. Primary target is the Republic Task Force. Battle Groups 1 through 3 chose a Venator and take it out. 4 and 5 concentrate on the Mandalorian loyalists. Task Force 73 is to take out the defense satellites and commence orbital bombardment on all pre-designated targets. Grievous shot out a rapid sequence of orders. Launch all fighter craft. 60% are to engage Republic and Mandalorian small craft. 20 are to remain as cap. The rest will escort the troop transports once the defense satellites are taken out. A veritable swarm of vulture droids exploded from the hulls and hangars of the Separatists' fleet. For a few seconds, it appeared that Grievous's command suddenly combusted and blew away in a storm of high-velocity debris. If he could, the CIS general would have smiled at the sight, though he lost that ability when he was captured by the never-sufficiently damned Jedi and Republic soldiers. He was going to see them all die screaming for what they did to him, and he was going to start with Mandalore. Even better, this time there were just a handful of Republic capital ships. Even their vaunted Guardian system wouldn't be enough to stop all the vultures he had to throw around. For the first time in months, the damned pieces of junk might actually prove useful as something more than target practice. Someone call our allies' ships and order them to engage the Republic scum. Grievous added as an afterthought as his eyes ran over the icons representing the small Deathwatch battle group. Have the fleet advance towards the gap between the Republic units and the Loyalists above the capital. Ahead third. That should have the enemy moving in the right direction, or they would risk letting his forces in bombardment range of the capital. Incidentally, if they moved to intercept his fleet, Grievous would have them where he wanted them, in position to be overwhelmed by his superior numbers and firepower. The general didn't pay much attention, as small dots representing concussion missiles separated from the Republic cruisers, nor did he particularly care that they were launching their small craft complement while doing their best to evade his long-range fire. It didn't really matter. The distance was shrinking by the second, and the enemy couldn't afford to decline battle. That left them with the option to stand and die, something Grievous was more than willing to accommodate. It was just too bad that most of them wouldn't live long enough to see him burn Mandalore. Speaking about the planets, there were icons rising from the surface, squadrons of the Mandalorian vaunted fighter transport hybrids. Some had the Deathwatch IFF, though most were the security forces QRF squadrons. A glance revealed that the enemy fighters wouldn't make orbit before TF-73 blew up the satellites in range and opened up on them while the small craft were busy clawing their way out of the atmosphere. The conclusion was foregone: most wouldn't make it, and the survivors would have to contend with overwhelming number of vultures. Grievous dismissed that distraction out of his mind and concentrated on the more dangerous enemy. Just a few seconds later, one of the Republic frigates vanished. For an instant, the general thought that a lucky shot got it, but he immediately dismissed that idea. His whole fleet was concentrating their fire on the enemy cruisers. The jamming produced by his ships ever since exiting hyperspace. The Republic commander undoubtedly sent for help. Unfortunately for the bastard, Intel was sure that the Closet Republic reinforcements were at least a couple of hours away, and even those were just a handful of Venators with a light escort. Not enough to change the tide here. TF-73 is commencing bombardment on designated targets, one of the B-1 droids crewing the bridge announced. That particularly message got Grievous' attention, and his eyes shifted towards a side screen near his seat. He pressed a few buttons, and his eyes started drinking the sensor feed from TF-73. Another button press later, and the image shifted to that of a camera showing the bombardment in all its glory. Mandalorian security spaceports, airfields, and the few dedicated military bases in range simply ceased to exist under barrages of railgun projectiles and turbo laser fire. The best were the targets near or within populated areas. Seeing them burn made Grievous feel a bit better, even if all that was merely a taste of things to come. Most importantly, the successful first strikes demonstrated that the planetary shield was down. With a bit of luck, it would stay down for a few more minutes, and then his fleet would be in weapons range of the shield generators themselves. Soon enough, Sundari was going to burn and veil with it. =RK=. Force composition above Mandalore. Republic Battle Group Commodore Gilad Palion, commanding 5 Venators, 15 CR-90 frigates, Mandalorian loyalists, TF-1, 4 Keldable cruisers, 12 Crusader corvettes, TF-2, 5 Keldable cruisers, 10 Crusader corvettes, TF-3, 4 Keldable cruisers, 11 Crusader corvettes, total 19 cruisers, 15 frigates, 33 corvettes, Deathwatch Squadron, 3 Keldable cruisers, 15 Crusader corvettes, CIS forces, Hostile 1/T, F-71, 1 Command frigate, 12 Munificent frigates, Grievous fleet, General Grievous commanding, 5 Comnan dreadnoughts, 163 Munificent frigates, total 5 CD, 3 cruisers, 1 Command frigate, 175 Munificent frigates. 104th Chapter 28, Part 1. Phase 28. Remember Mandalore. RK equals. Part 1. Bridge, MDF Cruiser, Conqueror, high orbit above Concordia. Senior Captain Arif Ven was the man in command over the detachment from the Mandalorian Defense Fleet under Deathwatch control. In fact, he was instrumental in persuading the crews of the ship in his battle group to shift allegiance from the weak new Mandalorian government to the only people who could restore the pride and glory of their people. It took all Ven's charisma, everything he had learned in his 40 years as a warrior, to persuade his men and women to follow him in what some would call treason. It was his conviction that the Death Watch would bring a future worth fighting for that finally turned the tide. Captain Ven used to be quite proud of his achievement for 2 weeks or so. The Death Watch was in a 3-way negotiation with Satine Kryze's people and the Confederacy, which as far as he knew were going quite well. Then the rumored Sith, who had been making a name for himself in the last few months by handing the CIS their collective heads, decide to come negotiate. On the Republic side, that's when everything started going terribly wrong for the Death Watch, and Arif began having treacherous second thoughts. There were certain things that were simply not done, like trying to assassinate someone who was having a drink in a bar instead of facing them in honorable combat. At least the end of that debacle, which was caught by multiple cameras, proved beyond a doubt that the new Republic general was actually a Sith, and not one of those Jedi peace-loving fools. Things continued to go downhill with Satine and company suddenly becoming somewhat competent, and anyone with 2 working brain cells to rub together knew who was to blame. And finally, it was tonight's event. Vale, the Sith, marrying one of the more famous Death Watch members with all that entailed, mind you, after facing the woman in a duel that showcased both their skills. In just a week or so, the Death Watch had fallen from an almost guaranteed shoe-in as the new government to being viewed as a bloody thugs who had no real respect for the traditions that made someone a Mandalorian. It all made Ven question his choices in life. All he wanted was for his people to stop being gutless wonders and earn back their pride and restore their way of life. Was it too much to ask? RK equals. So it comes to this, Commodore Ven snarled. The Mandalorian was standing in front of the tactical display, close enough that its holographic light made him appear as a ghost standing in the center of the bridge. Sensors, I want to know what those fools are doing. Navigation, bring us after them. Arif snapped, pointing at the string of icons representing the original CIS delegation. Those ships were burning straight towards Mandalore, while the Confederacy fleet that just arrived was already heading towards the Loyalists' battle group protecting the capital. Sir, we're being ordered to assist Task Force 71 with neutralizing any planet-side resistance. The comm operator spat. General Grievous claims control of all CIS and Allied forces in system. Arif didn't need to look at the young lieutenant to know that the man was beyond furious by those orders. Do we have any word from Vizsla or Death Watch Command? The captain asked. Just requests for our bases on Concordia to know what the criff is happening up here. Navigation, plot me a hyperjump right behind the CIS ships heading for Mandalore. We'll intercept them as they engage the orbital defenses, Ven ordered. Weapons, I want targeting solution on that command frigate the moment we revert to real space. He didn't really need to think about it. When all was said and done, he knew his duty as a Mandalorian warrior. Criff the Confederacy and Vizsla too, if the bastard believed it to be acceptable to let the tin cans pacify his home. For a moment the bridge crew simply stared at their commander. The man that persuaded them to join Death Watch, and by extension ally with the Confederacy, had suddenly gone 180 degrees on all he had been preaching for months. "What are you waiting for?" Ven snapped. "Supposed allies or not, I'm not letting those machine bombard Mandalore. You have your orders. Move it, people." The captain's voice echoed over the bridge. That broke the spell, and everyone snapped out of their short-lived shock, then started executing their orders. Contact the Blade Runner and Warlord. All cruisers are to take out the command frigate. Gunship squadrons are to concentrate on a munificent each. Once we engage the enemy, contact whoever is in charge planetside and inform them that we'll be available to provide limited orbital support for the next few minutes. Ven continued snapping orders. Arif's eyes never left the tactical display. He knew that no matter what he did right now, it would be too late. He had criffed up already. All his prepare contingencies, all the pre-calculated jump points were aimed against the Republic battle group and the Loyalists. Ven should have done the same for his supposed allies. If he did, his task force would have been able to jump them before they entered orbit and started bombarding the planet. As things stood, he would be a minute or two too late, and that could be a long, long time when someone was about to bombard your home. RK equals CIC Republic Cruiser Chimera. Low orbit above Mandalore. Avenger is to pull back behind us. Weapons, shift fire to hostile 4. Don't bother destroying the enemy. Shift targets once they're damaged enough to fall out of formation, Pellaeon ordered. His whole ship shuddered and shook as another well-aimed salvo went home. Shields down to 50%. We have bleed-through over the armor. Guardian system is down to 80%. The commander overseeing damage control announced a moment later. Enemy fighters are breaking through. There's just too many of them. That was the Guardian operator. TF-1 just lost a second cruiser. We're down another frigate too. Tactical added to the bad news. That left a single operation Keldable in that battle group. Purchasing stripped-out versions of the capital ships was biting the Mandalorians on the ass. Though that wasn't of any real comfort for the Republic officer. The only silver lining on the whole criffed-up situation was that the Death Watch squadron had switched sides moments after the CIS started bombarding Mandalore. A minute later, the last Mandalorian battle group finally came from behind the Confederacy fleet and struck them in the rear, putting them between two forces. That, in fact, was the only reason why Pellaeon and the Loyalists were still alive. Whoever was in charge on the CIS side was reasonably competent and went with a simple but brutally effective target, simply hit the enemy like a speeding freighter and overwhelm them. Under different circumstances, that tactic would have backfired. Pellaeon and the Mandalorians would have attempted to take apart the bigger Confederate fleet with hit-and-run strikes and might have very well won. However, somehow the enemy had succeeded in sabotaging not only the planetary shield, but the Theater 1 protecting the capital. Worse, the smaller yet potent defense field that should have kept the royal palace intact was down too, thus pinning the defenders in place. Vultures are swarming the resourceful. Captain Kie requests immediate assistance. Shift as much Guardian fire as possible in their direction. Do we have any available fighters? Pellaeon asked. Negative. The CAG answered immediately. All fighters and bombers are engaged. The Commodore stared at the plot. The escorts in range of the resourceful were doing their best, pouring laser fire and missiles at the robot fighters, taking apart the Venator. Yet the Vultures didn't care and continued to gut the cruiser while disregarding the incoming fire. A few dots designating a Mandalorian fighter squadron broke from their station around one of the Keldables and pounced the swarm with suicidal determination. They managed to take out at least a wing of the machines before being erased from existence by the enemy. The Chimera shook again, even more violently than before. Shields down to 35%. We lost a tubelaser bank. Guardian down to 65%. Pellaeon glanced to the left, where a small hologram gave him an overview of his command. The Avenger was hiding behind the Chimera with her shields down. The Resourceful had lost at least half its weapons and an engine, and the rest would follow soon. The Mandalorians were down to half their number, with most of the rest being damaged. The only reason Pellaeon's capital ships were in as good a shape as they were was that the CIS commander had shifted targeting priorities after the Death Watch squadron switched sides. Gilad doubted that he would still be around if the enemy had continued to concentrate all its firepower on his cruisers, As it was the case in the start of the engagement. Hold position. Sensors, have you identified the enemy flagship? Pellaeon asked. It's either CD1 or 3. We'll have it nailed in a few. All capital ships, switch fire to CD1, Pellaeon ordered, throwing the dice. He simply didn't have any more time. In just a handful of minutes, his ships might be unable to take out an enemy dreadnought before the ship pulled back and munificence moved in to block the firing lanes. If Gilad had guessed right, if his ships could kill or at least cripple the target, then they might buy a few more minutes. Yet it wasn't like being lucky would change the outcome. The enemy was down about a third of its original size, and all dreadnoughts were so far intact. The same couldn't be said for the defenders. Pellaeon glanced at the time. It was too soon. He knew Vale had reinforcements, though they weren't too close by necessity. All nearby systems and deep space were monitored by both sides to avoid someone pre-staging units for a surprise attack. Unfortunately, that didn't stop one side or the other from making a long-range jump, and the ships slotted for purple contingency were at least 5 minutes away. The Commodore grimaced. Even if the reinforcements arrived this minute, they might be too late to prevent the CIS from bombarding Sundari, as they did with a lot of other cities and towns in range of their guns. The casualties ground side were already in the double digits millions and raising by the minute. The next strike made the whole Chimera shake like a small fishboat during a storm. Shields are down to 20%. We have breaches in decks. The enemy formation was shifting, and that made Pellaeon tune out the DC report. CD1 was falling back under emergency thrusters, while at least 20 frigates were hurrying to build a physical barrier between it and the defenders. That was going to disrupt their carefully laid salvos and buy a bit of time. The Resourceful is down. It lost both weapons and propulsion. Enemy fighters are targeting the Avenger. Pellaeon could see it clearly, yet he couldn't do a thing. Every anti-fighter weapon in range was busy gunning down the vultures, yet there were too damn many of them. Sir, 2CD and their escorts are targeting us, the sensor operator shouted in distress, his composure breaking. All hands abandon ship, I repeat, all hands abandon ship. Set up weapons at automatic fire and navigation to ram the closest CD, then get your asses out of here, Pellaeon ordered. With the shields in tatters, the Chimera wouldn't survive more than a minute or two of concentrated fire. At best. At least some of the crew might make it to the pods before his ship went down in flames. 105th. Chapter 28. Parts 2 and 3. Phase 28, Remember Mandalore, equals RK equals. Part 2, Bridge, Corellian Cruiser. Freedom, Hyperspace. When on the bridge of her ship, Commodore Joanna Holt often felt like a queen of old. As a commander of the Freedom, she had more power at her fingertips than most people could imagine and less could comprehend. Her so-called Corellian cruiser was kilometers-long behemoth shaped like a dagger, which had enough firepower to shatter continents and boil oceans. Her command had defenses to rival her offensive power, both shields and meters thick armor belt among other things. The Freedom had a respectable sublight acceleration too. However, if there was one area where Holt's baby was lacking, it was her hyperdrive. First, it took a lot of fuel to propel something of that mass with any speed through hyperspace. Second, due to the Republic's laws, both range and speed for ships of this caliber were heavily regulated, even if in practice, Freedom and her sisters were a bit faster and longer-legged than was strictly legal. All of that meant one thing. When the Commodore got the call that Mandalore was under heavy Confederate attack, she was some time away even at best speed. It took Holt mere moments to read through Pellaeon's message, see what the enemy had brought to the table, and make a decision. Simply detaching her faster escorts was out of the question. They wouldn't arrive fast enough to make enough of a difference. Not after everything her command had been through ever since the battle for Geonosis. For weeks, Holt's battle group had been raiding CIS positions. Forward bases, mining operations, and even a few small shipyards met their end under the guns of the Freedom and her escorts. While the huge Corellian cruiser braved through everything the enemy had to throw at her and emerged intact, the same couldn't be said about her escorts. Corvettes, frigates, and even Venators were damaged or even destroyed on a dozen battlefields, even if the enemy had to pay with multiple shattered ships for every Republic unit they took out. After everything was said and done, The Freedom and her remaining escorts broke contact and made their way within range of Mandalore, though sneaking through the void between the stars in order to make it undetected wasn't exactly fun. Still, they made it, even if the closest reasonably safe waiting position was farther than anyone would have liked. Holt's battle group executed 2 jumps, a short one that placed them straight in the middle of the hyperlane leading from the core of Republic space towards Mandalore, and the second. That led towards the battle for the heart of Mandalorian space. For 20 minutes, Joanna kept a calm exterior, while her command flew at best speed through hyperspace. Her Freedom, 5 lightly damaged Venators, 10 light cruisers and 14 frigates and corvettes, augmented by the battle groups, depleted small craft complement, and the Guardian system that turned out to operate better than even its creators believed in their wildest dreams. Joanna hoped that it would be enough to turn the tide, because she knew that every minute it took her ships to reach Mandalore meant less of the defenders would be still alive. Real space reversal in 30 seconds, Freedom's navigator announced. This is it, people. Look alive. Primary targets are Confederate command ships. Fire Plan Lambda. Shoot the Munificents until they're disabled. We'll mop up later. I want all small craft launched the moment we're out of hyperspace, the Commodore ordered. She looked over the bridge, where every station was manned by experienced officers in the orange and black uniform of the Corellian Defense Force. A small, pride-filled smile appeared on Joanna's face. Just a few months ago, she and her people were inexperienced spacers who didn't really know what real war meant. All their training, war games, and anti-piracy operations meant nothing when compared with the hell that was Geonosis. For Holt and her fellow Corellians, that first battle was a crucible that forged them. It proved to the galaxy as a whole, and more importantly to themselves, that Corellia was still a power not to be taken lightly. Then she led a campaign that put small but not insignificant dent in CIS operations across 2 whole sectors. And now, when she was heartbeats from joining another major battle, Joanna felt only pride. Real space reversal in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The nav officer counted down aloud. The familiar image of hyperspace was replaced by serrated ranks of munificence as Holt's ships appeared above Sundari. While the Commodore had feared that she might place her ships out of position relative to the enemy by going straight for the capital, that turned out to be unfound. In fact, one of the first things she saw was a munificent shattering by the armored prowl of the Freedom, which simply ran the frigate over while slowing down from hyperspace transition. All stations, fire at will. Joanna gave the redundant order for the record. She knew her people were already acquiring targets and would be shooting in seconds. Comms, raise whoever's in charge and give me a sitrep. Tactical, what can you tell me? At that moment, the Freedom opened fire. Dozens of turbo laser emplacements spat emerald death at the heart of the CIS formation. Concussion missiles and proton torpedoes detached from their launch tubes, seeking their designated targets. The closest munificents died before their droid crews could react in any meaningful way. Their shields and armor were woefully lacking when set against even a fraction of Freedom's arsenal. Within seconds, a semi-sphere of shattered hulks surrounded the Corellian cruisers as she simply smashed aside the enemy frigates. Then her escorts joined the fun, though all their significant firepower appeared woefully lacking in comparison. However, the CIS units that found themselves under onslaught by the lighter Republic ships would disagree, if they lived much longer, that is. We've acquired the closest CIS command ship, firing now. The commander overseeing all of Freedom's weapons announced. In less than a minute, the Corellian behemoth had carved a way through the enemy fleet and simply shattered everything between it and the closest CIS dreadnought. Freedom's main batteries stopped firing for a handful of seconds as they retargeted and then unleashed more than enough firepower to kill a continent on a 2-kilometer-long Providence. The dreadnought's shields popped up like a soap bubble, followed by the armor that boiled for a moment before vaporizing. A heartbeat later, the whole ship shattered before its reactor added its fury to the colossal energies killing the Providence. Then the dreadnought simply vanished in an expanding cloud of molten metal and high-velocity debris. Well done. Find me the next Providence and kill it. Are there any friendlies still alive? Holt asked as her battle group continued to cut the enemy fleet in 2. We've got at least 1 active Venator the Avenger, and couple of Mandalorian cruisers on the other side of the enemy fleet. A single capital ships plus a few escorts is on our right flank, engaging the CIS. We're still trying to burn through enemy jamming. Permission to dump some of the reserve energy into EECM and comms. Granted. Burnt through the interference. Locate primary CIS ECM platforms and silence them. What's Mandalore's status? We're detecting signs of orbital bombardment, but nothing conclusive, ma'am. Working on it. Tactical, shift our escorts to the right flank. Once we've cut the enemy fleet in two, we'll take on the left group and the rest of the battle group will handle the other half. Equals RK equals. Part 3. Bridge. CIS command ship Deathbringer. High orbit above Mandalore. Fury. That was the only thing General Grievous could feel. He had practically won. Only a fraction of the enemy fleet was still operational and they were going to die shortly when those damned Republic reinforcements showed. Not just a standard Venator battle group or a usual Republic fleet. That wouldn't have enraged him so. Oh no, the never-sufficiently cursed enemy had to send a criffing Corellian cruiser, a ship built from the ground up to face and kill whole fleets. Those kinds of units didn't simply appear from nowhere. There weren't many of them in the whole galaxy, and any intelligence service worth their salt kept a track on their general location at the very least. An 8 kilometers long cruiser didn't just drop from nowhere in your moment of triumph. Not when intelligence all but guaranteed that there were no significant Republic forces close to Mandalore. Grievous balefully glared at the center of the bridge where a tactical display hovered above a holotank. 2 minutes and already almost half of his remaining fleet had been gutted, including 2 of the dreadnoughts, which apparently deserved special attention from the criffing Corellians. The CIS commander did what he could, tried to reorient his fleet so their main guns could shoot at the newcomers, but it was simply useless. He didn't need to look at the sensor feed to see that the firepower his ships could bring to bear on the so-called cruiser simply wasn't enough to break through its shields. The munificence simply died before they could put a second salvo in an enemy that had been designed and built to absorb such punishment and ignore it. All units are to cover us, get us on escape vector and in hyperspace as soon as possible. Any ship that can, start shooting at Sundari too. I want that city reduced, Grievous snarled. Despite his blinding rage, despite his need to see Mandalore burning, he already knew the outcome of this battle. With his fleet caught so out of position, even attempting to ram that cruiser wouldn't work. His ships would be reduced to flotsam before they could gain enough speed to be of any real threat to the enemy. Hells, the Corellians wouldn't even notice if they ran over a munificent or two. Grievous was pretty sure that they did it just after arriving. The general slammed an armored fist into the closest console, demolishing a comm unit. He had to get out of here, survive so he could rain his vengeance upon both the Republic and the Confederacy that so obviously betrayed him. The Deathbringer spun under emergency trust and headed away from the huge Corellian behemoth. Fortunately, that ship decided to take on half the surviving fleet alone, while its escorts dealt with the rest. That was the first good news for Grievous since everything went to hell. Now he had more than an even chance of leaving this cursed system in one piece. He watched with satisfaction as ranks of munificence placed themselves between the GAR reinforcements and his command ships. The frigates were dying under the concentrated fire of 5 Venators and their escorts, but not fast enough. The navigational computer was already calculating an escape vector, and all Grievous needed was a clear lane and a minute or two at worst. Uh-oh, one of the useless B-1s manning the bridge moaned. Grievous' eyes snapped from the tactical display and looked through the windows. Equals RK equals. Bridge. MDF Cruiser Conqueror. High orbit above Mandalore. An enemy command ships is making a run for it, the tactical officer shouted. A turbo laser salvo slammed again into the side of the Keldable and dug deep into the abused armor belt. The sheer energy transfer made the whole ship shake as if a giant had picked it up and tried to pry everything loose. Yet the Conqueror survived and continued to fight even if half her weapons were little more than burned-out pieces of twisted metal. "No, they aren't," Ven snapped. "Put us in front of them. I don't want the bastards jumping away." The under-equipped battleship changed vectors and accelerated as her engines went to full military thrust. Her remaining weapons spat defiance and scored another kill as a munificent broke under her barrage. 3 CIS frigates changed course in an attempt to block the Conqueror and unleashed their arsenals upon the unshielded cruiser. Armor buckled, ablated and shattered, opening multiple decks to space. Ven could see unlucky crew being sucked into the void, with the more fortunate dying as they hit debris. Targets changing course, we may not be able to block it, Conqueror's pilot reported. Ven looked at the plot. It was going to be very close, at best. He glared at the icon of the CIS dreadnought making a break for hyperspace. The enemy commander, the same one who ordered Mandalore bombarded, might very well be on that ship. The captain smiled. That bastard wasn't going away. Override reactor and engine safeties, ramming speed. It was a testament to his crew's dedication and discipline that no one flinched or asked for clarification. "Aye, sir, ramming speed," the pilot answered with grim determination. A few seconds later, Conqueror buckled under their feet as the engines went beyond their safe limits and the acceleration pushed close to what the inertial dampeners could compensate for. If the later failed, everyone on board would be transformed into a fine paste under a few hundred gravities of acceleration. On the other hand, very soon it wasn't going to matter. Ven stopped looking at the tactical display and stared through the windows of the bridge. He could actually see the dot that was the enemy dreadnought getting larger and larger. "All non-essential personnel have permission to abandon ship," the captain announced, though he doubted that many of those who could would run for the escape pods. They all made a choice because of him. That shredded any honor they ever had. For Ven and many Mandalorians, joining Death Watch had been the only viable way they saw in order to preserve their traditions. He and many of his colleagues in the MDF saw that the new Mandalorians weren't really interested in restoring Mandalore as it should have been. Instead, Satine and her government did their best to strangle the core of their culture, of what meant to be a Mandalorian. Mandalorians weren't a single race or even a species. It was an idea, a culture, and a way of life. A bitter chuckle escaped Ven's lips. All he had done for years was aimed at a single goal, to make his mother, the woman who took him after he was orphaned at shortly before the beginning of the Mandalorian Civil War, proud. Instead, Ven's actions made him and all who followed him traitors. They were supposed to protect Mandalore, not ally themselves with those who would see their home burn. There was only one way out of this dishonor. The CIS dreadnought was growing larger and larger. In moments, it would be all that could be seen from the bridge. The closest enemy frigates poured everything they had in stopping the Conqueror. The Keldable was little more than a wreck by this point, yet its engines were still alive and the bridge intact. A munificent tried to physically intercept the Mandalorian ship, yet before it could reach it, the frigate died a fiery death under the guns of a Venator, which immediately targeted another enemy that was trying to stop them. "May in death our honor be restored," Ven whispered. Equals RK equals. Bridge, CIS command ship, Deathbringer, high orbit above Mandalore. "Damn you all," Grievous roared. The last remaining Mandalorian ship in this part of the battlefield, one supposed to belong to his allies no less, was doing its best to stop the general's flight. A whole division of Republic light cruisers jumped behind that Keldable and opened fire, doing their best to cut off Grievous's escape route. The remaining GAR units were burning through the munificence, trying to protect Deathbringer, and bomber squadrons were unleashing hell upon any CIS unit they could reach. As if to prove him right, the deck below Grievous's feet shook. "Multiple hits. We're under attack by enemy bombers. The hyperdrive is out," a dispassionate tactical droid announced. "Damnation!" The general roared again and ran towards the nearest escape pods. He used his claimed lightsabers to carve through the bridge's armored door when it didn't open fast enough, smashed an unlucky B-1, and even cut in two a super battle droid that was between him and the way to relatively safety. Grievous jumped into the first escape pod he saw and slammed his fist on the release button. A door slid shut behind him, and a second later he hit the back of the pod hard as it shot out of the dreadnought. It wasn't a moment too soon, because 2 seconds later the burning wreck of the Conqueror slammed into the Deathbringer's belly. The dreadnought snapped in two before both capital ships were disappeared within a colossal explosion. The shockwave was enough to knock Grievous out and let him tumble through the escape pod as it raced towards the planet below. 106th. Chapter 28. Parts 4 and 5. Phase 28. Remember Mandalore. Equals RK equals. Part 4. Command Bunker. Below the Royal Palace. Sundari. Mandalore. That's orbital bombardment, and the shields aren't up. I summed up the situation while the ground shook for the 5th time. Considering we were at least a kilometer below the surface, that was saying many things about what was happening to the capital, and none of them were good. Feeling tens of thousands dying nearby, and many more on the planet wasn't helping either, even if it was an old thing nowadays. Just the price of being a trained Force adept. Of course, the dark side had to make it enjoyable, empowering and distracting business if I let her. Small wonder most Sith eventually went insane. We need the data links up yesterday. Satine frowned at the technicians who were busy doing just that. Primary landline is cut at the top, and our wireless equipment is being jammed. We're trying to compensate and burn through. Most of the secondaries are either down or jammed too. All we know for sure is that a large fleet jumped between us and Concordia before engaging out Navy. The tech didn't elaborate on how well that was going on. We could feel it as another tremor shook the bunker. Damn the Confederacy, Bo growled. If we make it out of here in one piece, I'll be having a chat with our intelligence services. I grumbled quietly. I wasn't accustomed to feeling this helpless. It wasn't like I could do much while being stuck into this bunker, and leaving it while Sundari was bombarded wasn't the best idea ever. I'm a bloody idiot. So it's your fault then? A trace of Obi-Wan's usual Kenobi-ness entered his voice. Apparently he was recovering quite well from our verbal confrontation. I should have a proper fleet in orbit and not relied on the shield. Damn the political consequences. I lamented. I would have in the good old days, while the planetary shield tech was just another superweapon cooked up by both sides of the Cold War. That would have been unacceptable, Satine said weakly. Is this acceptable then? Bo snapped at her sister. Of course not. The Duchess glared at my wife. Aren't you going to do something? Obi-Wan nodded at the women looking temporarily lost. Do I look like an idiot? Given Pelian's usual competence, he should have gotten the word out shortly after this mess began. The closest Venator battle group is 4 hours away, Obi-Wan pointed out. You would think so, wouldn't you? I have heavy reinforcements about 30 minutes or so out. Let's hope they will make it in time. Why didn't I know about that? Kenobi frowned at me. Need to know. I didn't want someone recalling that force and leaving us vulnerable. I shrugged. Given my current rank and GR command structure, it was well within my rights to do so. As far as most people were supposed to know, the Freedom and Company were either in the last stages of their raiding campaign or in transit towards a friendly port of resupply and repairs. Satine, you might be the only government Mandalore has left once we get out of here. You'll need to take charge and have a plan for the immediate aftermath. I changed the topic. We have contingencies for either attack or another civil war. The Duchess sighed. At least a few should do the trick. After this, Vizsla and the Death Watch need to go away. Bo added and gingerly rubbed the exposed side where her armor had been melted. Will you still try becoming Mandalore? Obi-Wan asked. Perhaps. We'll need to talk with the clan leaders who made it and make arrangements. Juggling being a Republic general and Mandalore will be an interesting experience. It would certainly eat up my time, even if the potential long-term gains might be significant. That was the rub of it. Was the war going to be over in the next couple of years, or would it drag on? I knew what was supposed to happen in canon, but those events were mostly derailed by now. Oh, Palpy's long-term plans were the same. Turn the Republic into his empire, but reaching that stage and wrapping up the war was going to be quite interesting for everyone concerned. I closed my eye and took a deep breath. I had to finally make a decision, and soon. My plans were going on reasonably good, given the overall situation. But if I was to go forward, I had to make up my mind on how I wanted the galaxy to look like at the end of the wars. After almost a year in this place, one of my initial plans, the one concerning a reformed republic, was looking more and more like a pipe dream, or more likely, a recipe for another civil war. That left either co-opting Sidious's plan or building up my own faction. My work with the Mandalorians could fit either if I became Mandalore. First things first, sort out this mess and then figure out the long-term plan I'll be going out with. We've partially burned through the jamming, one tech exclaimed. There's a second fleet in orbit engaging the first. Then he paused. I'm reading most of our navy as lost. Only a single Keldable IFF in orbit above Sundari, a Venator and 4 frigates. That's... Satine trailed off, horrified. It was about 30 minutes or so since the unpleasantries started, and the Mandalorian defense fleet was practically annihilated. The same went for my guard squadron. Here's to hoping that Pelion make it out in one piece. At least I had the insight to keep the rest of my staff away from here. HK and Arya were supposed to be with the forces vacating Geonosis, along with Piet and Veers. Ahsoka was still recovering in safety, and with the exception of Shak T, who was at Camino, those were the people I really cared about who weren't in the bunker with me. Not a big number, with a lot of them being more in the line of useful acquaintances than friends, but still, they might be enough to keep me from really going on in the deep end. If, when I persuaded them that my vision for the future of the galaxy was for the best, it would be worse on the ground. I concentrated on the issues at hand. I felt a lot of people dying, not only in Sundari. If the shields were down across the planet, even limited bombardment could cripple us. Satine's shoulders sagged. When all was said and done, today's Mandalore wasn't a particularly populated world. What made it important for the Mandalorians as a whole was that most of their industry was concentrated in here, while the majority of the population was spread all through the sector, with a few more millions playing mercs across the galaxy. Without a ready access to ships and heavy equipment, the Mandalorians were quite good infantry and excellent special forces, but only a shadow of what they could be if properly equipped. That's why Mandalore was important. Deny it to the Mandalorians, and they wouldn't be too big a problem for the next few years when you consider the scales on which both the Republic and CIS operated, and the enemy might have succeeded in that. If the industrial capabilities of this world were sufficiently degraded, Mandalore was going to be a net drain for resources for the time being. Then there were the political consequences, though I probably had a few days before dealing with them at anything but the local level. Once we're reasonably sure no one is going to take us from orbit, we should make our way out and see how bad it is, I said. Yes, we should. Satine nodded numbly. Try finding out whoever survived from my government, as well as the clan leader's status. Once communications are restored, announce that the Death Watch are a terrorist organization that just helped enemy forces bombard Mandalore. They're to be considered traitors to our people and handled accordingly. The Duchess stood straighter and spoke in a furious and determined voice. This was the first time I saw why Obi-Wan went after the woman. We may yet make a proper Mandalorian of you, sister. Bo nodded and smiled at Satine. I don't feel any immediate danger, Obi-Wan announced. Me neither, though we should be careful, I said after checking through the Force. I don't think that there was anyone left to bombard us. I owed Hold a case of the best Corellian brandy I could get my hands on. Let's go, Bo ordered and went to the elevator's control panel. She examined it for a moment and frowned. I don't think we'll be getting out that easily. The top levels have collapsed. There are additional exits, right? I asked. It was merely common sense. Yes. Satine looked at the guards, at least 2 we know of. The lieutenant in charge nodded. This way, ma'am. He pointed at the far wall. It was time to see how big a mess we had to clean up. Del-Qatar, you seem awfully detached. Bo trailed off. This is far from the first time I've been stuck on a world under orbital bombardment. Or ordered such, for that matter. As for the inevitable casualties I felt, after seeing it happen dozens of times on much grander scale, you either get accustomed to it and find some way to deal with it, or go insane. By any reasonable standards, any high-ranking Navy and Army officers in a galaxy-spanning power had to be somewhat warped in order to carry out their duties, because the price of doing business in our line of work was the death of millions, often billions, and seeing whole worlds burn as a matter of course. =RK equals. Part 5, Mandal Motors, HQ, Sundari, Mandalore. It took us a few hours to make our way from the bunker to one of the few intact buildings in the capital, Mandal Motors HQ, which had its own shield that protected it from the bombardment. While Sundari wasn't hit too many times, the orbital strikes either outright breached the dome or shattered it, raining burning and melted metal all over the city. There were sections where whole districts went up in fire, but the worst damage was caused by the dome collapsing over large areas of the capital. The overall death toll was estimated to be relatively low so far, but there were an awful number of missing or trapped persons, and most of them were unlikely to survive long enough to be dug out. We had a front-row seat of the devastation as we made our way to Mandal Motors, where we were received by Yomaget, who barely made it to safety before everything went to hell. Fortunately, the CEO was on board with using a part of his corporate HQ as a temporarily seat of government, and even better, he was among the majority of Mandalorians who were fit to be tied after the Confederacy attack. "I'll see them all burn for this," Satine seethed. The Duchess had been staring at the ruin that was most of the capital for the last 15 minutes, and all I could sense coming from her was unbound fury that would make a Sith proud. Obi-Wan was hovering protectively near his wife, but he was obviously distressed by her emotions and kept quiet. Meanwhile, Bo was out visiting the nearest armory to pick up an armor that lacked a large hole in its side. "I agree with the sentiment, but first we need to put our house in order." Horus nodded. We were in his office and had a great view of the destruction. All emergency services were out in force, augmented by the MDF and civilian volunteers, but it wasn't going to be enough for far too many people. Commodore Holt is doing her best to coordinate things in orbit and keep any more wrecks from hitting the surface. I informed the not really responsive Duchess, who was for all intents and purposes the government. We've been unable to establish contact with any of the ministers. One of Yomaget's aides came near us and reported, "The one piece of good news we have is that local MDF commanders have taken charge of SAR efforts in all affected areas, and we should have a complete picture shortly. We've got military units, supplies, equipment and volunteers streaming in from all over the planet." "Status on the planetary shields?" I asked. "Still down. The main control center took a direct hit and the secondary ones are in Deathwatch hands. We've got MDF units as well as some of your commando teams moving in." The same aide answered after glancing at the data pad in his hands. "At least the generators are safe." I noted. They hadn't been struck from orbit, and I had Commodore Holt drop a battalion of Corellian troopers, a third of Freedom's security detachment, to secure the generators. Once we got at least one control center under control and made sure that the power network was sufficiently intact, Mandalore would be somewhat secure. Right now, the only combat-capable friendlies in the system were the Freedom and her escorts. As powerful as that battle group was, it simply couldn't cover the whole planet against a smart opponent. Hopefully, the CIS would lay low until some more reinforcements could reach the system. After all, the bastards did burn through a lot of their available reserve while trying to take us all out. "Duchess Satine, right now our government might as well be gone. We need decisions on how to proceed." Yomaget changed the topic. "Decisions? We're already doing all we can. Not that's enough," Satine whispered. "What's happening with the Death Watch?" She sighed and turned away from the window. Most of their newer members turned on them once Vizsla ordered an all-out attack on the Loyalist forces, and the Confederacy began the orbital bombardment. There were firefights in dozens of locations all across Mandalore and Concordia. Once Loyalist forces were mobilized, most Deathwatch elements were overran. As far as we know, they still control only the SHIELD network control centers and 2 bases in the desert on Mandalore. However, there are significant holdouts on Concordia. The aide read from his datapad. "Not good enough. Can we strike at Concordia without compromising the rescue operations?" "Not with what we have on the moon." Horus shook his head. "Concordia is their stronghold after all. At least we have secure landing sites to use once we have the troops to send." "Vizsla," Satine spat the name. "Missing. He was supposed to be here in Sundari just before the attack. However, his current status is unknown." "Speaking about the enemy leadership, we've got confirmation that Grievous was in command of the CIS fleet that attacked us." I relayed what I learned from Holt's report after she had a few of the more intact Munificent boarded in order to secure intel. It's presumed that he made planetfall during the last stages of the battle after the Conqueror rammed his flagship. "I want him found," Satine snapped. She turned around and looked at her husband. Obi-Wan, please find him and bring him to justice. Kenobi stared at his wife for a long moment and nodded. I'll make sure he's dealt with. Satine might actually be useful for knocking the more unpleasant Jedi traits from Obi-Wan. Good for him. You aren't going alone. Omega Squad should be here shortly to act as our protection detail. Once they arrive, make sure they're resupplied and then you can go hunting. I made sure that Obi-Wan didn't go out half-cocked, because I doubted that right now he was in the right state of mind to simply crush Grievous using the Force. That leaves us with the issue of government or the lack of one. Horus looked at Satine. Many will blame this mess on you along with Death Watch. That earned him a glare by Obi-Wan, yet Satine simply nodded. If we had a better and larger fleet, this might have been avoided. The Duchess waved at the devastated city visible behind her. It was my government that decided a naval refit and expansion would be a waste of money. I'm aware where a lot of the blame lies, clan leader Yomaget. We need to gather the remaining clan leaders and vote in a Mandalore. After today's events, neither the new Mandalorians nor the Death Watch are viable candidates to run Mandalore. Horus looked at me. Are you still willing to be our leader, General? I looked through the window at the devastated city. I've seen and ordered much worse, yet the few hours we slogged through the ruins affected me. This was Mandalore, and even if I didn't really recognize this world anymore, it was the one place I used to call home before I met Ashara. Even if I had planned to burn it myself if the Death Watch actually won, which only made it worse, actually seeing Sundari wrecked. It changed something. Perhaps it was the way I used to feel about this place. Perhaps it was the fact that tonight I married Bo-Katan and became a Mandalorian myself, which meant that this was my home now. You know, I used to fight for an empire that wasn't mine, for a cause that I didn't really care for. I knew that the empire needed to change in order to survive once the old Republic was defeated. The Sith too, because it was only a matter of time before we tore each other apart. A tall skyscraper that had been burning for hours ever since tons of molten metal rained upon it crumbled in the distance. I think it's a high time to start fighting for something that's worth it. What is Mandalore to you? Yomaget asked. If you asked me yesterday, the honest answer would have been a means to an end. I answered truthfully. And today? Bo asked. I didn't feel her entering as I was too busy staring at the burning city. I turned around and looked at my wife, who now wore the standard armor of Mandal Motors guards. Today I watched my new home burn. I felt thousands upon thousands Mandalorians die. I can't bring back all the people who murdered by the enemy. I can't do much to help the countless trapped in the ruins. What I can do is promise that this, I pointed at the windows, will be visited thousandfold upon the Confederacy, and that I won't stop before our enemies are crushed, never to rise again. My voice was even though, yet full with the fury I felt and barely kept at bay. Vale's telling the truth, Obi-Wan added. He was giving me a wary look. Good. Satine nodded. General Vale, you have Clan Kryze's complete support in becoming Mandalore and prosecuting the war against the Confederacy of Independent System until a complete military victory. I second that. Bo smiled grimly. General, you have Clan Yomaget's support as well. Horus gave me a solemn nod. It's high time the galaxy remembers what happens when someone crosses our people. 107th. Chapter 28. Parts 6 and 7. Phase 28. Remember Mandalore. RK equals. Part 6. Mandal Motors, HQ, Sundari, Mandalore. Vale, what did you do this time? Valentra's holographic image scowled at me. I swear you exist to make my life harder. I love you too. I just did some contingency planning for when everything went straight to the deepest, darkest Corellian hell. I was stuck into a bunker with cut-off comms for the duration of the battle, I added. It wasn't as if I usually planned getting myself in such messes. I blamed the Force. The senator from Onderon and his buddies had been raising hell ever since they heard rumors about a new Mandalore. I've got the Chancellor, Senate, and even the Jedi on my back wanting answers. The intel services are spinning interesting tales about Mandalore. What is happening over there? Valentra exclaimed. So that's the spokesman for everyone in the Senate who wants Mandalore done in permanently. I wondered if I could spin this mess so I could get out smelling like roses, but I doubted it. Palpy had been playing this game for a long time and had too many connections within the Senate. He knew where most of the bodies were buried too, probably because he put a lot of them there himself. That left me with trying to minimize the political fallout and getting as much out of a bad situation as I could. Politics is what happened. Long story short, both the new Mandalorians and Death Watch are compromised and can't be said to speak for the Mandalorians in general. There will be a clan leaders meeting shortly in order to elect a Mandalore, who will be able to take charge of this whole mess. The only good news is that Pelion make it out of Chimera before his ship went up, and he's recovering in medical. Good for him, he'll be getting a medal or two for holding as well as he did against overwhelming odds. When were you going to officially tell me you made a play for Mandalore yourself? Valentra glared at me. Once I knew I would have enough support, so not to make myself look like an idiot. I sighed. You're aware that the only way we could trust United Mandalorians long-term is if the new Mandalore is friendly, right? If you're it, many senators will cry fault. Conflict of interests and such for starters, my colleague pointed out. To be honest, this isn't my first choice. If I got more time, I would have handled the job to Obi-Wan, but we simply don't have the time to make him a viable candidate. How so? Does it have something to do with certain marriages I heard about this morning? Valentra gave me an accusing look. You know, for people of our rank, there's a proper way to handle such things. No time. If it was practical, you would have been on the top of my invite list, I shot back. As for the Jedi, kindly inform them that Master Kenobi is in need for congratulations over his nuptials. He married Duchess Satine last night. So he's a proper Mandalorian now. Who did you marry, or is it too horrible to contemplate? Valentra sounded like he dreaded the answer. Bo-Katan Kryze, Satine's sister, I stated proudly. I've heard that name before, but don't recall where. Valentra suspiciously narrowed his eyes at me. She's kind of former Death Watch. Ah, I see. So I should brace myself for livid senators screaming that you've married a terrorist. Please, compared to me, my wife is a little angel. Yet the Senate didn't scream too loudly when I became Commander-in-Chief of the Republic's combat forces. You just gave a few freighter loads of ammunition to your detractors. You know that, right? Valentra sighed. I'm aware I'll have to answer some pointed questions by the Senate when I'm back on Coruscant. The political ramifications of my actions aren't lost on me. Trust me about that. Really? Vale, you know you're likely losing your current position over the mess at Mandalore, right? Valentra groaned. Who is on the short list to replace me? I knew it was likely to happen the moment diplomatic support for my mission to Mandalore vanished in thin air. Yularen, myself, Yoda and Plo Koon. Just make sure that the Jedi don't get the position or we're criffed. The thought has crossed my mind. Yularen is a likely shoe in after you left him in tactical command over Geonosis. That might very well be the deciding factor, Valentra said. Will my official endorsement help him or not? That remains to be seen. It will depend on the fallout from Mandalore. I see. What about reinforcements? I'll probably be Mandalore by the end of the day, and I'll want an official alliance with the Republic. As you know, yesterday the Mandalorian Navy ceased to exist. We need this system fortified against further CIS incursions for strategic reasons that had nothing to do with who actually rules Mandalore. Losing this hyperlane will have nasty consequences. I'm pulling 2 battle groups from the reserve and sending them to reinforce Commodore Holt. She'll be instructed to protect the system for the foreseeable future. That should be enough. Once I had a few silencer-equipped ships operational, Mandalore would be reasonably secure, and those forces would tide us up until then. On another note, the investigation of Skywalker's stunt is almost complete. All the agents need is to talk with yourself and the Skywalkers. When are you going to make them appear? I'm not really comfortable with you keeping a general under wraps for weeks, not to mention the senator. Padme's still in coma, though the last I heard she's likely to recover soon. As for Anakin Skywalker, do you really want a loose cannon like him running through the galaxy without supervision? I'll collect and bring him to Coruscant once I've wrapped up things here. I groaned. When all was said and done, Anakin's screw-up was going to be a massive pain in the ass to handle. You should have just dumped him to the Jedi. Valentra shook his head. and risk him falling to the dark side or even joining Dooku and company in a misguided attempt to save his wife. That whole mess was a textbook example on how to mess up with a Jedi's head and potentially turn them. Quite successful too. Damn, is he salvageable? What is Skywalker likely to do if found guilty on all charges? That depends on his state of mind, but I doubt that he'll quietly fall on his sword. The man has little loyalty to the Jedi Order or the Republic as a whole. Instead, he believes in people, chief among them being his wife. Amidala might be the key to dealing with him, but that depends on her state of mind once she's awake. Skywalker's a ticking time bomb then. Valentra groaned. It's a distinct possibility. What are you going to do when you become Mandalore? He asked the big question. Align the Mandalorians with the Republic, make sure this system is secure and sick them on the Confederacy. In the medium to long term, make them useful allies while keeping the clan leaders from getting any ideas about galactic domination. After all, we don't need a repeat of the Mandalorian Wars. You know, the Senate won't take it that way. Of course not. Many will see it as me building myself an empire, the bloody idiots. They might very well be right, but that was another question. General Vale, the clan leaders are arriving as we speak. Your presence is required in Conference Room 1. One of Yomaget's aides interrupted us. I'll be there momentarily. I dismissed the man and returned my attention to Valentra. I'll be back ASAP and will do my best to give you some cover as far as the Senate is concerned. They'll be too busy dealing with my new status if things don't go ever more wrong over here. I have to go. May the Force be with you. I waved at the grumpy-looking general and cut the connection. It was time to face the music, as they say. I needed to become Mandalore and finalize my plans before heading back. At least the Confederacy attack gave me a starting point for dealing with the Mandalorians. I was planning on using the inevitable outrage and fury to begin some creative nation building that would hopefully culminate into the creation of a stable power block under my command. Yet, first things first, I had to be chosen as a Mandalore before I could go ahead. =RK equals. Part 7, Conference Room 1. Mandal Motors HQ, Sundari, Mandalore. If there ever was a huge neon sign announcing that I was living in a different era, this was it. We were here to decide who would be the new Mandalore, with all major clan leaders who survived the attack either present in person or via holocom. This hallowed location wasn't the bridge of a mighty warship proudly displaying the power of the Mandalorian people for everyone to see. We weren't in the command center of a large military base surrounded by enough warriors and equipment to take over a couple of well-developed worlds. Instead, we were gathered in a lavishly decorated corporate conference room. I'm sure most former Mandalores would either find it funny or were too busy rolling in their graves. At least the seats were comfortable. I cut short my musings and returned my attention to the proceedings. Clans Yomaget, Awad, Skirata, and Kryze were present in person. Many more, almost 24, chief among them, Ordo, Bralor, Gedik, Priest were here via the holocom. At least a third of them were former Death Watch sympathizers who turned on Vizsla and company once Grievous tried to burn Mandalore. All of them agreed that whoever remained loyal to Death Watch needed to die, and that Satine's new Mandalorian's pacifistic policies were directly to blame for the Confederacy executing a successful attack. That was it. In one stroke, Grievous managed to criff up the only two groups which had a prayer of keeping Mandalore together, and now no one could agree on what to do. Well, almost no one. We're all aware that our current government is dysfunctional and won't be accepted as our leaders, even if most of them didn't die yesterday. Horus was doing his best impression of snake oil salesman. The less said about Vizsla and his goons, the better. He trailed off as even mentioning the Death Watch leader in this company led to loud grumble and a lot of quiet cursing, Clan Vizsla to hell and back. We were back at this, everyone knew it. It had been repeated again and again for hours, yet we weren't closer to making a decision. I had my supporters, enough to ensure that no one else could become Mandalore, which wasn't as good as it sounded, considering that after Vizsla criffed up any chances he had for the title, there simply wasn't another viable candidate. However, that didn't mean I would be elected, which left us with a lot of accusations and power vacuum. You see, a lot of the clan leaders were quite wary of choosing a Mandalore in the first place. Doing so was going to shake things up. and would technically place them under his or her command. Oh, there were traditional ways of either avoiding or contesting commands given by Mandalore. Most of them led to personal challenge and fair combat. At least half of the clan leaders didn't appear fit enough to even slow me down if we had a go at each other if I wasn't using the Force. That left them with naming a champion, but doing so would be opening another can of worms and hurt their standing. Others were apprehensive of where I would lead Mandalore, especially those who were part of Satine's new Mandalorians. I've heard a lot of bemoaning our situation, a lot of accusations hurled at various parties. Yomaget continued, "What I haven't heard are plans on how to deal with our predicament." "We know your idea. Put the Sith in charge and all will be well," Merrick Bralo said, sounding unconvinced. He was the leader of a now small and scattered, yet still quite respected clan. Back in the day, his ancestors were allies, more of 10 than not, but that didn't mean much nowadays. "Do you really expect me to wave my hand and solve all our problems? I can lie my ass off and promise you solutions that would make everyone here happy, and we all would know that as the lie it is. We all know the galaxy doesn't work that way." I shrugged. "What I can offer you all is a shot at a better future for Mandalore as a whole, and most of you in particular. Some of us have seen what General Vale has to offer and are quite pleased with it," Horus added. "Even before the immediate need of rebuilding the Mandalorian Navy, the designs I provided were going to see Mandal Motors make a killing, so Yomaget was in my corner for self-interest, among other things. The same could be said for Thang Awad. His wife and former clan leader didn't make it through the bombardment. The man was out for Confederate blood, something I would gladly offer, along with lucrative contracts and designs for the consortium ran by his family. Arguably, those two clans were the most important as far as influence and resources go, and they were firmly on board, which meant that made their enemies mine by extension with all that entailed. There were more than a few clans in opposition just because of who my most powerful supporters were. Why did I want this job again? Some of you want to relieve the old glories of the Mandalorian people. I pointed at a lot of clan leader, including every single Death Watch defector. You earn for the time when the very mention of Mandalorian warriors made people take notice and tremble. You want to experience that glory, the honor and satisfaction of meeting worthy opponents and besting them. Of course, if they did it as most Mandalorians in the past, everything would end in tears after significant chunks of the galaxy got burned again. At least Stephen had the right idea, but the war with the Republic put his plans on hold. It was too bad that the aftermath of the Empire's victory and subsequent disintegration in a civil war put a stop to his vision for the future. Others want a stable future. I nodded at those representing the new Mandalorians. You want to change how the galaxy see us, and make no mistake, to the average person we're more often than not viewed as a scourge upon everything they hold dear. Understandable too. It wasn't like Mandalorians hadn't burned, raped, and generally wrecked the criff of the surrounding sectors and beyond since the original Mandalorian wars of Revan's era. Do I need to spell out why clans Yomaget and Awad support me? I looked at the clan leaders. I'm offering you a different path. I smiled and continued. It's probably the one thing we could be thankful to the CIS about. They made most of the galaxy hate their guts and yesterday declared themselves our enemies. You intend to use the Confederacy? General Skirata took a guess. Indeed. While lacking any shred of honor, they're a powerful enemy, one we need to crush or see Mandalore burn again. Destroying them will offer us all the glory and combat a warrior could crave. My smile widened. Doing so the right way will change how we're seen by the rest of the galaxy. I offer you a path that will earn us many honors and acclaim. Bringing the Confederacy down will ensure we will be seen as protector of justice, a path that will inevitably lead to many conflicts worth fighting. It was true, even if I wasn't doing it from the good in my dark heart. Enlightened self-interest was the name of the game, and it worked. This is inspired by the Super Commando Codex, isn't it? Skirata asked. You should know, General. You're one of the survivors from the true Mandalorians after all. When all is said and done, Jaster Meriel had the right idea. I'm merely expanding on it and making the best of the bad situation we all find ourselves in. I looked at the assembled men and women. Most of you crave for the restoration of Mandalorian honor, don't you? You won't find it in the overly savage and wasteful ways of the Death Watch or the brutes who inspired them. Ah, you see both the Death Watch and new Mandalorians as people who rejected the old codes. Surprisingly, that came from Thang Awad. They did, for the wrong reasons. Most people in Death Watch didn't know the meaning of honor. They paid it lip service while using our traditions as excuses for their criminal enterprises. I looked at the defectors from that faction. The new Mandalorians overreacted after the Civil War and rejected the warrior codes altogether, both the good and bad. There were good things. An offended new Mandalorian sneered, "One's clan is their family. I see nothing wrong with being loyal to them in most cases. I see nothing wrong in approaching combat with honor and not going out of your way to cause slaughter for slaughter's sake," I stated. Not to mention that it was ridiculous for a Sith to lecture people about how being too brutal and being murderous criffing bastard for its own sake hurt your agenda much more than it helped. That's surprising coming from a Sith Lord. Cole Ordo spoke for the first time since the gathering began. Though I shouldn't be surprised given who you are. Oh, I used to be one of those stereotypical murderous bastards a long time ago. For no good reason either. Just because it was often expected as a Dark Council member's apprentice, and I was too afraid of the consequences not to act as a psychotic killer. I shrugged. What? I was far from perfect, and used to be a coward. It turned out that killing and torturing copious amount of people could be surprisingly doable if the alternative was either suicide or to die screaming. By the time I had enough personal power to stand up to the likes of Barras, I had been quite warped. If it wasn't for Stephen, Mako, Veta, and few other people, I would have easily fallen to the dark side as a way of escapism from the hell I found myself in. My words made the clan leaders think. If it wasn't for a handful of people that helped me find a better way, I trailed off. Criffit, all my friends were dead for a long criffing time. For a moment I was almost overwhelmed by a wave of fury aimed at my predicament, and it took me a few seconds to put my emotions back under control. That's the core of what I'm proposing. Honor and glory earned in battle as soldiers instead of raiders and brigands. That's more than what the Death Watch under Vizsla ever was. By now you're all aware that prior to the CIS attack, security forces and Republic commandos raided couple of hundred targets all across Mandalore. All of those were Death Watch criminal enterprises. There is more than enough evidence in the cities and countryside away from the bombarded areas to back up my words. Some of Death Watch activities were admittedly less than legal. Vincent Geddick admitted. He was one of Death Watch's oldest and staunchest supporters. However, he obviously drew the line at aiding a foreign power in bombarding Mandalore. He had the distinction of being the first one to turn his clan against their former comrades, and apparently wasn't afraid to own up to his criff-ups. Even if this was our first meeting, the man was able to earn a bit of respect with his actions so far. Those who still wished to sell their services could do as honorable mercenaries instead, as common thugs and guns for hire. I continued, as for the new Mandalorians here today, yesterday we all saw where your pacifism led. It might sound good in theory, but the galaxy isn't a nice forgiving place. Without sufficient armed forces to ensure neutrality, the only thing pacifism makes you is easy targets. It was time to throw the new Mandalorians a small bone. Still, I neither require or want to conscript those who won't volunteer to be soldiers, ready to defend Mandalore and smite our enemies. A society can't exist if everyone is a warrior on the battlefield. It requires many, many people in positions that have little to do with combat. That doesn't make them worthless either. The basic idea does have its merits. How do you propose to actually pull it off? Braylor asked. If we make you Mandalore, all of us will sacrifice something, even if it's just a bit of our freedom to act as we will, without a higher authority. What are you putting on the line for Mandalorians as a whole? What are you going to sacrifice for our people? In various ways. First and easiest, my personal resources, which as a few of you can attest, aren't exactly insignificant. Yomaget smiled at the thought of what I offered him and Mandal Motors. I continued to outline the general plan I presented to Skirata and the rest of the clone army trainers, which had been further refined by their suggestion. Little things like consolidating the whole sector under Mandalorian aegis, using resources either loaned from the Republic or appropriated from the enemy to jumpstart an industrial buildup that would turn us into an economic powerhouse. The fist small steps that would turn the Mandalorians into a real nation besides being only culture. It might work, though I don't think that the Senate would authorize a lot of help coming our way. Awad noted. I'm not expecting them to. Let's be honest, as far as I know, about half of the Senate wants us as allies, while the rest would love nothing more than see us gone once and for all. I'm banking on the strategic importance of this system and working through the GAR for both securing it and helping with our industry. Both the Army and Navy could use additional sources of spare parts and equipment closer to the front lines. Are you sure you could pull it off? Skirata asked. Using my position? Probably not. General Valentra, who oversees the logistic side of the conflict, can be persuaded to help in that regard anyway. I nodded at Skirata. That links with clan leader Baylor's other question. What I'm putting on the line for you all? I looked at them. Right now, as the commanding officer of all Republic combat forces, I'm one of the most powerful people in the galaxy. It is a position that, barring a major criff up, I could conceivably hold, at least until the war is over, and further leverage it into either political office within the Republic or to practically continue controlling the GAR once the conflict is resolved. And, Geddick prompted me to continue, if you choose me as Mandalore, I'll be kissing that position goodbye at the very least. It could very well cost me the rank of a general as well. When all is said and done, it is a great sacrifice. Together we might be able to make Mandalore a power that would give both the Republic and Confederacy pause, but that day is years away at best. I looked at Braylor. I am a Sith Lord. We crave power. It's almost everything to us, and that's what I'm ready to sacrifice in order to lead you. Because yesterday I had an epiphany. You're my people, and you are worth it. Well, that gave them pause. Truth to be told, I wasn't entirely honest with them. While I had incredible power at my fingertips, given my current rank, that position was quite precarious without solid political backing, and that was something I lacked. With Amidala's poisoning and Skywalker going on the deep end, I lost any support Padme could provide on that front. Hopefully she would recover and might still be useful, yet her political backing was going to be worth quite less than before, at best. That left me with only two feasible backers. One was Corellia, but that would take a lot of work to come into fruition. Just a single meeting with the planet's leadership was merely testing the waters after all. My other choice was Mandalore. While I would have preferred for things to have gone differently here, well, there was nothing about it. I couldn't conjure a 6 or more months before this whole situation came to a head and thus engineer either Kenobi or Bo-Katan as viable Mandalore candidate as per my original plans. In the end, I was left with rolling the dice and doing my best to take advantage of the situation I was maneuvered in by Palpy. All I had left was hoping that the fallout I would soon face would be worth the eventual gains. At least I came ahead with a badass and beautiful wife I was fond of. We've been here for long enough. Yomaget slammed his fist on the wooden table dominating the room. We've all heard what General Vale intends to do if he becomes Mandalore, what he offers and is prepared to sacrifice for us. Considering that we simply lack another candidate that might garner any reasonable amount of support, it's high time we vote. Horus stood up and took a deep breath. Clan Yomaget nominates Delcatar Vale, leader of Clan Vale, for Mandalore. He has our complete support. Yomaget stood at attention and gave me a Mandalorian salute by thumping his chest above the heart with his right fist. Clan Awad. Thang voiced his support, followed by Satine and Skirata. The die was cast. 108th. Chapter 28, Parts 8 and 9. Phase 28. Remember Mandalore. RK equals. Part 8. Mandal Motors, HQ, Sundari. Mandalore. It's funny, I don't feel different. I expected something more. I trailed off and looked at my wife, who was standing next to me and gazing through the windows. Congratulations, Delcatar. Bo paused and smiled. Mandalore, she savored the word. I can't say I really expected this when I met you back on Ryloth. Nonsense. All the histories will claim you knew my greatness the moment you laid your eyes upon me. They'll add something about love at first sight too. I quipped and earned myself a poke in the ribs. as long we're the ones who get to write them. The alternative is not acceptable. Number it's not. My wife agreed. It was a bit touch and go, but in the end I did get just enough support to earn the title and everything that went with it, which was a greatly increased workload. My sister isn't too pleased with your decision, Bo informed me. The best thing for her is to be away from here. Many will blame her for the devastation. She was in charge, had been for more than a decade. In the end it was Satine's responsibility, even if she had less control overall than many would like to believe. True enough. We need a new ambassador to the Republic, and given her connection with the new Mandalorians and overall pacifistic nature, the Senate will love her. If she plays her cards right, they will never see her coming. It's a pity it took this to open her eyes. Bo sighed as she stared at the devastation. I put a reassuring hand on her shoulder and squeezed it gently. At least she sees it now. There are some who wouldn't open their eyes even after something like this. Are you talking from experience? Yeah, I sighed. Hopefully, once she awoke, Amidala would be sane and her eyes would be open too. If the bioattacks on Naboo couldn't do it when combined with her current ordeal, nothing was going to cut it. Besides, that way you'll be able to keep her near Kenobi. Those two need some chilling out. The Jedi Council's reaction to his marriage might put a damper on their honeymoon. What about ours? Satine's a big girl, she'll have to improvise. I want you to lead my personal strike force, small, elite, geared for rapid deployment and facing Force adepts. Incidentally, that would keep us quite close. Can't keep your hands off me already? Bo chuckled before becoming serious. How many men and is there any special equipment you require? Besides your personal arms and armor, I'll be providing access to top-of-the-line Republic gear as well as whatever specialized equipment money can buy. Does that include basilisks? Speaking about them, they're quite sturdy and might have survived even if we have to dug them out. And yes, our unit will be equipped with them once sufficient numbers can be produced. As for numbers, I want at least a platoon. I'll see to it. Bo nodded. You know some of the clan leaders will be trouble even among those who supported you, right? My wife changed the topic. And I don't mean challenging you to a single combat. Undermining my authority and trying to assassinate me, you mean? Yep, I'm expecting it. Though they just have to join my fan club just like the rest. Some people didn't really like me taking charge and issuing running orders moments after I was given the title, even if they expected it. Step 1 was consolidating here on Mandalore, eliminating Death Watch remnants and whatever CIS forces made it to the ground, all the while executing SAR. Once that was done, Skirata, who would be running thins for me here, was going to storm Concordia and clear it from DW elements. Step 2 was for Yomaget, Awad and their colleagues, kicking up the industry in high gear, as well as implementing radical expansion. They would be opening new factories, building new shipyards, and working on building a brand new navy, as well as producing the heavy equipment for a whole army. It was a tall order, one that they couldn't do without outside help. That was step 3, and for me to worry about. My Black Ops units would be funneling both funds, equipment, and specialists this way, while I had to not only make the call for the spread-out Mandalorians to come home, but also plan the incorporation of this whole sector under our rule. All that was just the beginning too, and on top of my other duties. It will be a few days before we leave for Coruscant. I want you to select your men as well as assist Cole as much as possible. I'll do all I can to help him. Bo nodded. I made Ordo the one in charge of the Mandalorian Protectors, the formal name of the local police and non-military security forces. That had the benefit of giving him a lot of resources for locating his daughter. I was careful not to mention to his face that she might not have survived the bombardment, and even if she did, it was likely that her Death Watch kidnappers killed her and made themselves scarce. I'll get to if this is all. Yes, I'll see you tonight. And I'll have you all to myself then. Is that a promise? If you're a good Mandalore? Bo pulled me closer and gave me a searing kiss before winking and sauntering off. I'll let you do the boring stuff. I watched her retreating form until she left the office I had commandeered for my own use and shook my head. I'd forgotten what married life used to be and didn't know how much I missed the little things until now, even if I knew it would be different with Bo. All right, what was the next thing on the agenda? Damn it, I needed another aide or two. At least I'll be getting Piet back soon. Ah, yes, choosing people to head education, medical and civilian infrastructure from the new Mandalorians. Then I was going to interview Braylor for internal minister or something in that vein. Criffit, I've forgotten how much work was setting up a new government after the previous one got vaporized. At least this time I didn't have to deal with newly conquered world, so there would be less issues than Balmora and Alderaan, right? Criffit, who am I kidding? It was just a matter of time before something went to hell just to be a massive pain in my ass. I had to get myself into gear, because in less than an hour I would be meeting Awad to discuss the standard equipment for the planned Mandalorian army. Once that was done, Thang, who was to be my deputy financial minister, and Yomaget, the actual financial minister, would be both on my case to figure out how the criff we were going to pay for rebuilding after the attack, creating a brand new navy and army, not to mention the industrial expansion. That wasn't going to be fun. Note to self, see if I could capture high-ranking members of the banking clans and blackmail them for copious amounts of money. RK equals. Part 9. Hunter Flight, Great Desert, Mandalore. Obi-Wan paid barely any attention to the commando squad strapped beside him in the passenger compartment of the Mandalorian fighter transport. The Jedi was busy contemplating everything that happened lately and the ways it affected him. He toned out the clones' banter and the whine of the engines, focusing on his issues. Kenobi felt drifting, lost. Less than a day ago, he, a Jedi Master, practically trampled on the Order's rules and millennia of tradition by following his heart. Worse, he hadn't really thought about all consequences, despite he felt sure he had considered the ramifications of his decision. The inevitable confrontation with the Jedi Council he expected, and it would be something to deal with in just a few days. Spending the rest of his life with Satine, he simply loved that idea. Even becoming a Mandalorian hadn't sounded too bad as long as he didn't act as the stereotypical brutes as whom the average Mandalorian had been portrayed across the galaxy. Things weren't so simple and clear-cut after all. Obi-Wan could very well imagine being a Mandalorian and yet doing his best to protect the Republic from her enemies. Those things weren't mutually exclusive after all. Besides, strictly speaking, there wasn't something within the core of Mandalorian culture that forced someone to become a murderous bastard. He should know, after all, Kenobi did go over a refresher course of Mandalorian history and customs while contemplating if marrying Satine was a good idea. What he found hard to reconcile within himself was how the love he felt towards his wife was affecting him as a person. Merely admitting it to himself hadn't been too hard, despite how it felt at the time. Marrying, on the other hand, it was different, a proof of his commitment to Satine. A step he simply wouldn't want to take back, even if he was offered the choice. The things we do for love, Obi-Wan whispered too quietly for the clones to hear. That was the crux of the matter, wasn't it? Ultimately, his marriage was a choice between what he believed in as a Jedi and what he wanted as a man in love. If he had to be honest to himself, Obi-Wan chose to be selfish, and that changed him. It subtly shifted his priorities and made it easier to disregard his nature as a Jedi when making a decision. His mind drifted back to the bunker. A week or two ago, Obi-Wan was sure he would have confronted Vale violently over the murder of the two medics. He still wanted to do it. That wasn't a necessary kill in the heat of combat. It wasn't an understandable military decision that led to those deaths. Morally, Kenobi knew what was the right thing. Legally, too, even if it wasn't really his place to place judgment in that context. Strictly speaking, that was for the local security forces to deal with, even if it was now probably a moot point. Vale was busy making his bid for Mandalore, and if successful, the worst he was going to face would be a personal challenge or two from family or friends of those men. As a Jedi, yesterday Obi-Wan truly saw what a Sith in control of the dark side looked like. He knew his duty then. Kenobi was ready to fight an enemy he had been trained to smite ever since he could remember anything. Instead, Vale started talking, and Obi-Wan stayed his hand long enough to listen. At the beginning, it wasn't because he believed that Del-Katar could persuade him not to attack. It wasn't even because Kenobi was pretty sure he couldn't win. He would have fought anyway. What stayed his hand was Satine's presence. There was a part of Obi-Wan buried below all his training as a Jedi that simply refused to expose her to an all-out fight between him and a Sith Lord. Yesterday, Obi-Wan refused to even think about that, yet the thought was in subconsciousness. It was in his heart. Kenobi was afraid of dying without spending more time with his wife. He was afraid of what would happen to her if Vale had to cut him down, even if Satine was the Sith sister-in-law. So he listened, prepared for his last stand, yet his heart desired for a way out. When Vale offered it to him, Obi-Wan's hands became clutched fists. Even worse, Kenobi could see that he did the right thing in that bunker. Dying there wasn't going to achieve anything. After Windu's actions during the Jedi Temple's attack, an attack against Vale by another Jedi Master executed without proof for betrayal against the Republic was going to damn the Jedi Order in the eyes of the galaxy. "Well played," Obi-Wan muttered. "Sir?" Nina, Omega Squad's leader, asked. "Nothing, I'm just thinking aloud. Carry on." Obi-Wan dismissed the clone's question. The Jedi Master hadn't thought about that in the bunker. Kenobi had acted out of reflex born of his training, of the way he had been taught. The right thing to do seemed so obvious then, and he never thought about the consequences beyond either somehow succeeding or his much more likely death. Obi-Wan wanted to think that he knew Vale somewhat. The Sith simply wasn't going to tolerate another attack upon himself by the Jedi. At best, the man was going to wait until the war wasn't hanging in the balance before retaliating. At worst, a confrontation between the man commanding all Republic combat troops and the Jedi was going to lead to a short and brutal civil war that would have damned the Republic. The worst thing was that even now, Obi-Wan wasn't sure where exactly Vale stood. While he had his suspicions, he wasn't sure about Delkatar's long-term plans. Ultimately, was the Sith an ally to the Republic, or would he see it fall once the war was over? Would he continue with his live and let live policy towards the Jedi? Would Vale try to corrupt them or simply offer another way? What was the truth and what were lies spun by a Sith Lord? Kenobi shook his head and concentrated. His mind was wandering, avoiding a topic he feared to contemplate. It was something Satine asked him shortly after they arrived at Mandal Motors HQ. "What would have you done in Vale's place?" Obi-Wan's wife had asked. "I know what I should feel. He did kill 2 of my people, yet he saved my little sister." Obi-Wan was afraid to face that question, even if Vale did ask it too, back in the bunker. He had done his best to dismiss it. After all, a Jedi's answer was obvious, was it not? It was anything but, even if you didn't bring morality into the question. At the time, Satine was the leader of Mandalore's government. She still was, unless Vale was already chosen as Mandalore. That by itself warped the question. Because of her position, Satine was more important than 2 regular medics. Sacrificing them to keep her alive and hale would be more than a fair price to pay. Doing so would have been the correct decision on many levels, and a proper Jedi would likely agree, even if doing so came dangerously close to flirting with the dark side. However, when he was asked that question, Satine's status didn't matter. It was about what Obi-Wan would do to keep his wife alive. Now he knew the lengths Vale would go to. Not too long ago, he saw what Anakin would to for a very long shot at helping Padme, his now not-so-secret wife. What was Obi-Wan Kenobi going to do to keep Satine safe? The Jedi was afraid of that question. It made him shiver as if the dark side itself was touching him when he thought about it. However, giving an answer, that simply terrified him. Because Obi-Wan Kenobi, a Jedi Master, simply didn't know. He might simply uphold his principles as a Jedi, or do anything in his power to keep Satine safe. Just as he had no compunction of going after Grievous, not because it was his duty as both a Jedi Master and a Republic General, but because his wife asked him to bring the Confederate General to justice. Obi-Wan sagged in his seat and wondered what was he supposed to do. In his agitated state, he missed the dark side's gentle touch that offered salvation. =RK equals. Look alive, boys. Target side. 10K out. Obi-Wan's self-reflection was interrupted by the pilot. Is he alone? Kenobi was grateful for the distraction. I'm seeing a handful of commando droids and a few of SBs. Drop us behind the closest dune and strafe them a few times. I'm dealing with Grievous. You take out his guards, Obi-Wan ordered. Yes, General. Nina answered. The pilot's confirmation came in the form of him opening up with the craft's laser cannons. Scratch some droids. Be aware, enemy is splitting up. I'm dropping you on Grievous's right flank. Kenobi submerged into the Force and let it revitalize him. A moment later, his worries were erased and replaced by unrivaled clarity. A minute later, Obi-Wan dropped from the hovering transport with the clones landing around him. Targets breaking to the right of your position. Good hunting. The assault transport screamed away to avoid any potential AA fire. Go. The Jedi Master ordered and sprinted after Grievous. He had no problem sensing the cyborg presence in the desert. Within seconds, Kenobi had the CIS general in sight. Grievous was busy climbing up the next dune, and unfortunately for him, the Jedi was in no mood for a protracted chase. Obi-Wan raised a hand and pulled back the cyborg, who gave out a strangled cry and tumbled down amidst a small sand avalanche. Kenobi jumped down and drew his lightsaber. Grievous, the Jedi stated blandly, and activated his weapon. The cyborg stood up and drew a pair of stolen lightsabers. Kenobi? Grievous looked surprised, seeing the Jedi wear Mandalorian armor. Obi-Wan narrowed his eyes. He recognized those lightsabers. They belonged to friends of his, who were now dead. Murdered by the being in front of him. Just like that, the calmness Kenobi felt since letting the Force flow freely through him vanished. This thing, it was responsible for the death of millions, probably billions. It murdered Obi-Wan's friends, and it bombarded Mandalore, making Satine feel awful. It was Kenobi's duty to put an end to that abomination, and that's exactly what he was going to do. Obi-Wan shot forward without even thinking. He was acting on instinct, reinforcing his body with the Force without even thinking, yet she obeyed. Grievous parried the first strike, yet stumbled back, surprised by the strength behind the Jedi's attack. The cyborg tried to retaliate with his other blade, but his slash was parried with contemptuous ease before Kenobi's saber struck again, forcing the other general to retreat another step. It took all of Grievous' mechanically assisted strength and speed to keep Obi-Wan's azure blade from striking it. Despite that and all of his training, the cyborg was forced into a relentless retreat. That confused the Confederate commander. He had fought Kenobi before and was aware of how good the human was. This was something quite different. The Jedi was attacking with savagery he had never displayed before. Worse, the attacks were coming much faster and stronger than ever. Obi-Wan's blood sang. He fell into a rhythm of ceaseless attacks and found that for the first time in his life, he really enjoyed a battle. Kenobi found himself pouring all his frustration, uncertainties and fear into his strikes, and it was liberating. That thought made him falter and gave Grievous a chance to jump back so he could take a breather. The Jedi frowned. He couldn't really feel the dark side trying to influence him. There was no anger to feed her, even if he was frustrated. Yet there was fear. The cyborg counterattacked before Kenobi could think about it all. The Jedi easily fell into a Sorosu form and started deflecting the incoming attacks. They were much easier to read than ever before. Anticipating them was simpler, natural. "You're different today, Kenobi," Grievous spoke. "For a moment there you fought almost like a Sith." Obi-Wan's eyes widened at that declaration, and it almost cost him everything. The cyborg used that brief surprise to explode into motion and did his best to dismember Kenobi. Only a last-ditch shove using the Force kept the Jedi intact. Grievous stumbled back and laughed. "Did I hit a sore spot? Did you enjoy my little performance?" Granted, it was interrupted before the best part. The mechanical menace went silent when Obi-Wan went on the offensive. This time Kenobi felt anger. Grievous dared joke in his face over the murder of countless people, Satine's people, Obi-Wan's people now. It was Grievous and Vizsla who planned the attack and almost got Satine's sister murdered. Tried to kill them all with orbital strikes and only failed because of Pelion's last stand and the death of the Mandalorian Navy. It dawned on Obi-Wan that he was facing one of the people that almost murdered his wife yesterday. Kenobi's anger boiled, and his composure simply shattered. A cold wave washed over Obi-Wan as he fell upon the cyborg, and he felt more powerful with every strike he delivered at Grievous. The combatants blurred as they engaged into a flurry of blows, and then it was over. A metal hand flew away, separated at the elbow. Obi-Wan continued his onslaught and slammed his lightsaber into Grievous's remaining blade again and again. The third strike was too much, and it broke the cyborg's guard. The azure blade flashed down and severed Grievous' other hand at the shoulder. The two generals glared at each other for a long moment. "I won't yield," Grievous screamed. "I won't be put into a criffing jar again." If he was physically capable of it, the cyborg would be foaming at the mouth at that point. "Surrender?" Obi-Wan asked calmly. There was no trace of anger in the Jedi's voice. Kenobi felt cold. He could sense the dark side's touch upon him. Despite what he expected, she wasn't tempting him, wasn't demanding that he strike down Grievous. The dark side simply waited, ready to follow his directions. "You did escape the last time," Kenobi reasonably pointed out, surprised by Grievous's reaction. "I won't be held again," the cyborg shouted and lunged at the Jedi. Obi-Wan raised a hand and picked up Grievous using the Force, suspending him in mid-air. "What am I to do with you?" the Jedi wondered aloud. Grievous decided to stay silent at that point and simply balefully glared at Kenobi. "You know my wife wants you brought to justice." Obi-Wan repeated Satine's request. There was silence before Grievous's laughed. "Wife? The Jedi's poster boy is married. Was she here yesterday? Did I get her?" The cyborg sneered in an obvious attempt to provoke Kenobi. "She was. In fact, we married yesterday. This is her world you wrecked," Obi-Wan snapped. "Good." Kenobi could imagine Grievous's smile, and the very thought made him snarl. Below his helmet, Obi-Wan's eyes got bled into yellow. The Jedi's hand gripped his lightsaber harder. "You know, there are probably a lot of good reasons why I should bring you in right now. Intelligence among other things. After all, you should stand trial for my crimes." "Crimes?" Grievous laughed. "My only crime is that I've been a more successful general than all of you Jedi put together. It took a Sith being in charge of your forces to stalemate us." "No matter how loath am I to admit it, you're right about that," Obi-Wan noted. "In the end, we Jedi are diplomats and peacekeepers, not soldiers or proper generals." Kenobi sighed. "A Jedi in my position would capture and bring you back." Grievous' glare intensified, and he started struggling into the telekinetic grip. "As I am now, I no longer have the right to call myself a Jedi," Obi-Wan stated in contemplative tone. "I chose love over the Jedi Order. It's hard to admit it, but today I'm on a path that one day might make me choose between Mandalore and the Republic." Kenobi paused. "I'm pretty sure I'll take my wife's lead on that one." Obi-Wan smiled, even if Grievous couldn't see it. "So what? It's funny, you know. I've walked away from all I knew, and I didn't really realize it up until now. I've already made my choices. All I needed was to understand why." Obi-Wan took a step forward. "If I continued to consider myself a Jedi, I would have been torn apart by divided loyalties." Another step, and Kenobi was within a hand's reach of the cyborg. "I didn't really get it until we crossed blades. If you were anyone else besides Vizsla, I might have failed to understand. Yet fighting you, a man who tried to murder my wife, it was a revelation." "What the criff are you talking about, Jedi?" "I'm rambling, am I not? Feeling free. It's strange, you know. Liberating." Obi-Wan stared at Grievous. Kenobi raised his lightsaber and brought it down in one swift motion, then he released the cyborg. Grievous fell on the ground in two pieces. It was strange. Perhaps it was because Obi-Wan didn't strike down in anger. He didn't feel the dark side falling upon him, didn't feel like falling after executing Grievous in a cold blood. Instead, Obi-Wan felt at peace now that a threat to his wife was removed from existence. "Nina, status report. Do you need assistance?" Kenobi activated his calm. "We're just wrapping up, General. Grievous. He won't trouble us ever again." "Good work, sir," the commando congratulated him. "Hunter flight, come and get us." Obi-Wan ordered their ride to collect them. On the flight back, Kenobi would have time to contemplate his actions and the conclusions he reached. 109th Chapter 28, Parts 10 and 11. Phase 28, Remember Mandalore. RK equals. Part 10, Industrial Sector. Sundari, Mandalore. I've been Mandalore for 2 days, and I already hate the bloody job. Endless meetings, most of which with people you could hardly stand. Enough bargaining and deal-making to make a CEO of an interstellar corporation jealous. What felt like everyone in the government shoving their problems up the chain until you had to deal with them personally. And those were only the highlights. Pro tip, if you intend to go into politics and raise up to the top, think long and hard if succeeding is going to be worth it. Pro tip the second, it's much better to be the power behind the throne instead the one actually having to do all the bloody work. I couldn't wait to wrap up the most immediate troubles and leave Skirata to deal with this shit, even if that was going to mean I would have to handle the Senate with all that entailed. On the bright side, Piet arrived last night with reinforcements from Geonosis and some good news. Operations there were complete. All ground forces were extracted, the Navy had recovered or blown up every wreck we left after the space battle, and all our units had pulled out for either some R&R or to reinforce various positions across the galaxy. Even better, he came on the same ship with Arya and HK, who I immediately sent to find Vizsla. Dead or alive, I wanted him brought in front of me. He and the Death Watch were going to serve as great scapegoats for everything wrong on Mandalore. It was going to be mostly true, too. I had what survived from Satine's government PR department point out at every opportunity who exactly allied with the Confederacy and invite them here, preferably just before or after the latest casualty report went public. Meanwhile, I was playing the role of the good and concerned Mandalore, visiting the worst hit parts of Sundari when there were journalists around to show everyone I actually cared. That's why right now I was visiting the industrial sector. It was last on my list after checking up the heavy-hit residential districts. I used every opportunity to promise bloody vengeance to whoever was listening. And there were many pissed-off Mandalorians who loved the idea. At least this time I wasn't suffering alone. Thang Alwad was with me, showing the flag, so to speak. He had his hands full too after his wife didn't survive the attack and had to ascend as both a clan leader and a CEO of their consortium. In fact, at least a third of the factories lost in the capital were either owned or worked with Alwad in weapon manufacturing. We should have 60% of the damage fixed within the week. Thang informed me after we spoke with the reporters. That sounds reasonable. I looked at the rows of large buildings strewn around us. While a significant section of the dome had collapsed in the area, the weapon factories were built with the expectation of such shenanigans. Most were superficially damaged and could resume production once the area was cleared of debris and the rail networks used to shuttle resources and components in were certified safe for use. The rest would need up to a few months of repairs, with at least 2 factories being a write-off. Owad trailed off and pointed in the distance. My eyes followed his hand, and I saw what used to be a factory. Most of the building was simply gone, with only twisted parts of its metal outer walls remaining. It was obvious that the facility had taken a direct hit during the bombardment, and that was something it simply wasn't built to handle. While a lot of the weapon and munitions factories on Mandalore were excessively armored and otherwise protected, that was primary as a safety concern pushed by Satine's government. Most of the manufacturing centers simply weren't expected to handle even limited orbital bombardment if both the planetary shields and the Theater 1 covering the capital were down. "Do you have numbers on the recovery costs?" I asked. "Do you really want to know?" Alwad sighed. "The preliminary cost I gave you during Outlast meeting is going to rise. A third of the cargo subways are down with some tunnels collapsed. Fixing that will take both time and money. We'll be able to partially sidestep the issue by using small cargo vessels to deliver resources to the surviving factories, but most of them simply weren't designed to work that way. Not to mention that doing so would be logistically troublesome." "Solutions?" I asked. "A lot, all requiring more time and money than might be practical. It all came back to Mandalore simply lacking enough money to do everything I wanted in a reasonable amount of time. Your plans are good, Mandalore. Most of us like them quite well, in fact. It's feasible to turn Mandalore into an industrial powerhouse that can build us both a powerful navy and a respectable combined arms army. We can even do it in the time frame you require. We just can't do it with the money and resources at our disposal. The best we can manage is to start on the initial stages of the build-up. You and Yomaget made me well aware of that. That's why we'll be meeting tonight. There are some decisions to be made about the future, but this isn't the time or place to discuss it. =RK=, Death Watch Safe House near Sundari, Mandalore. Is the intel any good? Nina asked. He and the rest of Omega were tapped for another hunt. This time they were after Vizsla. Personally, the clone officer hoped it would be successful too. Seeing Grievous cut in pieces a few days ago was simply indescribable. The clone felt elated, especially when the damn cyborg did its best to kill him and his squad. After dealing with Grievous once and for all, Nina assured that General Kenobi would be unable to pay for a drink in any bar in the galaxy frequented by GAR personnel. Considering that this Vizsla character helped arrange the tiny orbital bombardment incident that almost saw Omega buried in a bloody warehouse, Nina was on board with dismembering that bastard too. That's what Intel claims, General Vale's pet psycho droid deadpanned. By now you should all know not to trust Intel without double and triple checking no matter what they claim. That way you'll live longer, HK sagely advised. He might be a royal pain in the arse, but he knows what he speaks of. Arya nodded. At least as far as war and killing people is concerned, the Chiss woman added. So we're going to check. Carefully. Nina shrugged. It wasn't like Intel failed to burn him in the past, though usually he tried very hard not to think about those cases. The small group was hidden behind a hill overlooking a tiny settlement, just 2 rows of building set up around a road leading to the capital. The only reason the place existed was a small, mostly automated mining operation for various silicates which could be found under the local desert. The only notable thing around was a pair of landing pads and 2 hangars, barely big enough to handle the fighter-transport combo favored by the Mandalorians. That's the general idea. Remember, if practical, the general wants Vizsla brought in alive. However, we're under orders not to risk our lives over that lowlife. Arya, who was technically in charge of the operation, ordered. She might be a Sith in training, but that didn't mean she wanted to explain to her master how she got his soldier killed. What's the plan, ma'am? Nina asked. HK's going in as a scout. He can use his stealth field to check if our quarry is here. You're setting up a sniper nest up there. Arya pointed at the top of the hill after checking up for any nasty surprises. The rest of us will sneak closer and be ready to provide support if HK finds either Vizsla or any trace of Deathwatch presence. Any concerns? Arya asked the veteran soldier. Nina was surprised that his opinion was asked for in the first place. In his experience, a lot of officers, especially Jedi, didn't bother to do so once they made up their mind, even if he had worked with a few who were a pleasant exception to that rule. Well, ma'am, if I might suggest a few alternations. =RK equals. Part 11. Mandalore's Office. Mandal Motors, HQ. Sundari, Mandalore. Can you remind me why the criff I wanted this bloody job in the first place? I snapped after finished skimming through yet another datapad and placed it next to the growing pile of complete paperwork. Despite my best efforts, the pile with things to go through was steadily growing, and I was yet to start the various meetings I was scheduled to attend today. It sounded like a good idea at the time, sir, Piet guessed. My aide had arrived 24 hours ago, and by this morning he was up to speed with his expanded duties. It wasn't something that made him particularly happy, but at least handling all the additional work coming his way would look great on his resume, both in the army and civilian life. None of that changed one inevitable fact: running a whole world, much less what I was hoping to become a proper interstellar nation, was an awful lot of thankless, usually boring and often frustrating work. And that was even before having to personally meet with any politicians hell-bent on making your life harder. I was already missing the good old days when I could simply force-choke the bastards and call it a day. Returning to Coruscant was going to test my patience and self-control like few other things did. Any good news, Firmus? I asked my aide. Orbital cleanup continues apace. Relatively intact hulls are being dragged to the shipyards for evaluation and either rebuilt or will head for the breaker to be repurposed. That particular idea came from Horus, reusing the more intact wrecks to bolster the Navy sooner than would be otherwise possible and stripping everything else that wasn't blasted to scrap for parts. That idea was going to give us the skeleton of a Navy a bit sooner, so I wasted no time in approving it and relocating resources for the venture. Of course, that plan was going to create additional work for Mandal Motors and make them a nice amount of money besides the other projects they were already busy with. The corporation was cheerfully expanding its industrial capabilities and hiring a lot of people in order to fulfill all the contracts I was sending their way. Guess who was going to be receiving huge chunk of Mandalore's budget? I don't know about being a good news, though there are a lot of reporters from all over who want to speak with General Kenobi. It finally leaked to the galaxy at large that he was the one to take out Grievous, and every reporter in the Republic wants to interview him. Better him than me. Schedule a press conference. I hope Obi-Wan won't be too put off with me for throwing him to the crathhounds that is the media. It's not like I have the time for the likes of them. There will be enough of that when we're back on Coruscant. I grumbled. That reminded me. Now I had a press secretary, a survivor from Satine's government, who was busy fending off the media ever since I became Mandalore just a few days ago. The last bit of good news, your wife has finished selecting your personal guard, and they will be ready to meet you later today. That's one bit of tradition that I hope won't bite me in the arse, I stated. A proper Mandalore had to have a proper retinue made of warriors, an honor guard if you will, even if he was supposed to fight and win his or hers own battles. Part of it was symbolic. You couldn't really hold the title without having people ready to fight and die for you after all, and that had to be obvious to all. Second and more practical, they were supposed to be Mandalore's agents, commanders, aides, etc. Unfortunately, I simply lacked the knowledge about the locals to make such a selection myself. Usually most of the honor guard would be part of my own clan, but considering that there were two of us, me and Bo, that wasn't possible. That left me sending my wife to recruit me a retinue and trusting her judgment. Good to hear. I trust that there will be more than enough bad news and troubles needing my attention to offset the good ones. That was inevitable, really. Yep. First, there are various smaller corporations that want a piece of the action and will be raising hell until they get on board with the various expansion program. If we had the credits to burn, they would already have contracts or be negotiating ones, I grumbled. All they see is their big rivals receiving tons of government money, long-term work, and good working relations with Mandalore. Apparently that make them nervous. Piet shrugged. That really wasn't his area of expertise. In fact, I should be having another aide to deal with the economic side of things, and I would be meeting her later today once she was up to speed with the situation. None of that changed the fact that the smaller corp would be a problem until I threw them a bond, and I simply lacked the resource to pull it off right now. I glanced at the datapad containing my schedule. I'll be speaking with people from the Economy Ministry in the afternoon. They might have an idea what we could work out. What's the next problem? The consequence of the orbital bombardment and dealing with former Death Watch members. Yeah, that was going to be delicate. The diehards were easy. We were going to kill the criff out of the fools. The ones who joined only in the last few months in a hope of ousting Satine's government and then switched sides when the DW began acting crazy, or at worst, when Grievous enacted his own bit of murderous insanity. Well, the later groups were harder to handle. A lot of people wanted the heads of anyone associated with the Death Watch. Considering that my wife was a former member, that was out of the question, though I would have to soothe a lot of ruffled feathers. Then there were some clans that actually expected rewards for turning on the Death Watch when the chip were down. Just another political landmine I had to carefully handle, preferably before it blew up in my face. I had the sinking feeling that Piet was just starting. I was right. =RK equals. Death Watch Safe House, near Sundari, Mandalore. The accommodations left something to be desired, but given the circumstances, they were much better than the alternative. Either a prison cell or more likely a blaster bolt to the head. The Death Watch's leader had no illusions what awaited him if he ever fell in the hands of the Loyalist after the unsuccessful coup he was forced to launch by Grievous. Vizsla morosely looked over his surroundings, plain grey metal walls of a small spaceport's overseer, a desk made of the same stuff, a few not particularly comfortable chairs, and a computer terminal. At least the air conditioning was working, or considering the location, a rocky patch in the middle of the desert near the capital, Vizsla and his warriors would be nicely cooked by now. Sir, someone tripped the seismic sensors under the hill. The cameras show nothing. One of the guards spoke over the comm. I'm activating the QRF and awaiting instructions. Vizsla couldn't say that he was particularly surprised. After the series of debacles over the past few weeks that culminated into the death of everything he had been working towards for more than a decade, another setback was all but expected. If he had to be honest to himself, it was a small miracle that his location hadn't been tracked down earlier. The overall destruction visited upon Mandalore by that fool Grievous explained it. The Mandalorian snarled at the very thought of that cursed cyborg. Not only the machine's madness wrecked Vizsla's plans, it turned out to be for nothing too. Both Satine and Vale survived, and that Sith bastard was chosen as Mandalore too. The Death Watch's leader grit his teeth in fury and frustration, doing his best to calm himself down so he could think rationally. It was high time to get off the planet, perhaps to Concordia, though it was only a matter of time before the Loyalists sorted up themselves and retook the moon. No, going back home would meant willingly entering a trap. Vizsla knew that his only acceptable alternative was to retreat, not flee, damn it, and openly join with the Confederacy. Either that or simply vanish in obscurity far away from this sector of space. However, the latter alternative simply wasn't acceptable. He hadn't worked this long, hadn't sacrificed so much to quit now. I need information. How many of them are outside? Are there ships in the air or in orbit above us? Vizsla shook himself out of his funk and took charge of the situation. I want all our warriors ready for action. We're getting out of here. Understood. Something flickered on the motion detectors to the west, though they're clear now. I'm pretty sure our sensors are being spoofed. That wasn't standard MDF forces tactics. He should know. Those on Concordia who answered to him had identical training and equipment to their friend on Mandalore itself. Republic Special Forces, Vizsla grumbled. That probably meant they had some of their ships in orbit waiting to intercept anyone who decided to flee Mandalore. He smiled thinly. Prepare our guest for transport. She's our ticked hour of here, so make sure the enemy doesn't manage to spirit her away. At least that particular exercise of futility that could be laid on Grievous' penchant for criffing up properly laid plans was going to be useful now. Vizsla took a moment to check up his weapons before picking up his helmet from the desk, where he had discarded it earlier, and made his way out of the office. The very fact that the enemy was skulking around instead of attacking or leveling the place from orbit probably meant that they either suspected he had the captive in here or they weren't sure that there was a Death Watch presence in the area. At any rate, Vizsla had to make sure the Republic forces, who for all intents and purposes had taken over Mandalore through their general, were aware who he had in his custody. Otherwise, things might just go to hell like everything else. Our guest is ready for transport. Everyone is armed, armored, and awaiting orders, sir. The same guard announced. At least Vizsla still had a few competent people left. That thought gave him much less comfort than it should have. In the last week, he had lost too damn many excellent warriors and good friend. Good work, Sergeant. Here's what we're going to do. Equals RK equals. You don't want to do anything hasty. A voice boomed over the spaceport speakers. Republic forces, we're well aware of your presence. I would want to draw your attention to the office building's door. You probably recognize our guest, the daughter of one of your general's supporters. Well, that's unexpected, Arya grumbled. She was about 800 meters from said building and had a decent view of its entrance. That's an understatement, Nina muttered quietly. They could all see a pair of Mandalorians, complete with full Death Watch armor, escorting a young girl, and the kid was outfitted with a harness rigged with enough explosives to level the spaceport. Did I mention I loathe the Death Watch? The team's sniper added. I have a good visual of the vest. A lot of explosives, including at least 3 thermal detonators I can see. Dev, I'm patching you camera feed. They're making a point, or just insane. The demo expert grunted. Can't do anything remotely. Trying to jam the area won't be good idea either. Orders, ma'am. We either let them go or kill them all. Arya sighed. If they surrender, most of, if not all of them, will get a trial and get shot if they're lucky, and they all know it. The Chiss woman closed her eyes and examined the situation through the Force, looking for a better solution. She recognized the girl, and what the Death Watch mouthing off over the loudspeaker said was true. What Arya didn't know was if the kid was expendable or not. Astra frowned at that thought. She had been expendable too. After all, the bastards who created her did send her to die. The kid didn't have much more choice right now that Astra once did. We're going to walk out of here, board our ship, and leave the system, or the girl gets it. It's not like we have anything left to lose. Orders, ma'am? Nina asked. Arya opened her eyes and stared at the girl, wondering what to do. 110th, Chapter 28, Part 12. Phase 28, Remember Mandalore, equals RK equals. Part 12, Death Watch Safe House, near Sundari. Mandalore, its curious thing, hatred. As someone who trained to be a Sith, Arya Astra should be familiar with that emotion. Along with fear and anger, that's what she should be feeling most of the time. Well, at least that's what your average Jedi would tell you. However, in her short life, Arya had seldom found herself hating anything, besides the people that created her as a disposable weapon and sent her to her doom. Yet on that day in the deserts of Mandalore, she hated. The Force adept saw the parallels between her situation and the slip of a girl, rigged with enough explosives to evaporate everything nearby. They were both unwillingly used only to be discarded afterward. It was probably worse for the hostage. At least Arya didn't know better or anything different at the time. Order, ma'am, Nina repeated in a damningly neutral tone. Arya glared at the spaceport. Her mind was discarding any plan she could think of as soon as they surfaced. Letting the Death Watch go was out of the question. Besides, it would be pointless. Astra didn't need the Force to tell her that the hostage would be as good as dead or worse if the kidnappers made it out of system with her. Simply assaulting the spaceport would be futile. Arya could feel the determination mixed with desperation coming from the Death Watch. They knew they were dead men if the rest of the Mandalorians got their hands on them. The Force adept could almost see what would happen if she ordered an attack. The Death Watch would fight with fanatical tenacity, determined to kill as many Republic soldiers as they could before detonating the charges put on their hostage and going out with a bang. Arya needed another solution, one that didn't waste the lives of the people under her command, yet dealt with the enemy and saved the girl. Nina, on my signal, take out the Death Watch in sight, suppress all exits and get Dev to the hostage so he can dismantle the explosives. The Sith in training ordered. Yes, ma'am, you have a solution on the little issue of the spaceport blowing up if we do it? The clone commander asked. I'm creating one now, Arya answered before closing her eyes and diving into the Force. Astra's perception expanded, and she could feel every sapient being in the area. The clones, Death Watch, including those she couldn't see with her eyes, the hostage, and a handful of utility droids. Arya's body sang with power as she concentrated and drew more of the Force within herself than she had ever before. The sheer power made her light-headed and euphoric, made her feel as if she could do anything she desired. Arya pushed those thoughts aside, though it wasn't without some effort, and concentrated on the task at hand. A pleasant tingle ran up and down her skin as her power coiled around and through her, and then the Force adept was finally ready. She raised a hand, the gesture helping her mind guide the energy that was still raising in potency, and unleashed it, guiding the Force as well as she could. A shimmering purple-tinted energy field surrounded every living thing within the spaceport and froze them all in place. Go! Arya hissed the order while straining to hold a stasis field going upon more than a dozen targets. Execute, execute, execute! Nina snapped over the comm and blaster fire erupted all over the spaceport. Arya could feel people dying, which allowed her to drop the stasis upon their cooling corpses. That was the only thing that allowed her to keep the technique ongoing as long as she did. Every moment was a battle. While the Force felt almost eager to obey, the strain of channeling and precisely directing so much power upon that many separate targets she couldn't actually see took their toll. For the first 10 seconds or so, it was practically euphoric. The feeling of unrestrained power was almost addicting. The same went for the tingle of the Force flooding her being. However, the longer Arya had to keep the technique ongoing, the worse it became. The pleasant tingle became an electric current. The energy coursing through her veins turned from a soothing spring into a river of molten lava. Arya knew that if she kept it up for too long, the strain of channeling so much energy would simply fry her body from the inside. If she could remain conscious for long enough, that is, because with every passing second she was drawing more and more exhausted. Then, after what felt like an eternity, it was all over. Arya felt the last man she held in stasis die, and she released the technique. A small smile graced her lips, then her eyes rolled, and there was only soothing darkness. RK equals. Admin secure. Status report. Nina ordered after gunning down the last Death Watch member in the building, who was conveniently frozen in place along the rest of his murderous buddies. No contacts outside, Fee announced. I'll keep overwatch. The sniper added. I'm securing the hostage. Make sure someone doesn't interrupt me and blows up all sky high. Dev sounded a bit strained. It was never a good thing when your demo expert had a similar tone. I'm covering them. The synthetic voice of the general's pet killer droid added over the comm. All clear in the annex. I'll check up the ship next, Core added. I'll make another sweep of the admin and join you outside. Nina paused. Mom, what's your status? The clone asked. He frowned when no response came back. Anyone? Do you have eyes on the boss lady? A moment, sir, Fee said and continued a few seconds later. I have a visual. She's collapsed 400 meters east from my position. Advise? I'll check on her once I've swept the building for any other unpleasant surprises. Keep overwatch. The last thing we need is for some holdout to blow us all up. Equals RK equals. Military Hospital, Sundari outskirts, Mandalore. General on deck, Nina's voice snapped like a whip. A moment later, his commando unit stood at attention. At ease, soldiers. You did well. I beamed at them. Oh, they did all right. My first stop was the morgue to make sure with my own eyes that Vizsla was very much dead, which he was. Missing a forehead, and most of the head would do that. Exemplary even. A terrorist leader dead, a high-value hostage saved, and no friendly casualties. I continued. Nina shifted at my last words, but only gave me a formal thanks. Don't worry, my apprentice is my next stop, and I'm pretty sure she'll be all right. By your account, she simply overstretched herself. I added while examining the clones' feelings. They appear to have accepted Arya as one of their own. Good for them. It might be interesting to see where that would go. Besides, I could always use another Spec Ops unit. I almost smiled when I went past the clones towards Arya's room. Kola Ordo and Mira were nearby, and I could feel their relief and happiness without problem. It was fortunate that my apprentice was able to wrap things up so nicely. I couldn't have done it much better myself, to tell the truth. She earned me and the Republic some political points with the clan leaders. Vizsla was very much dead, and Ordo's kid was recovered mostly intact. Then there was what that meant on a personal level. I owed both Arya and Omega Squad. I would have hated to see Mira dead. When all was said and done, she and Cole were probably the last connection I had with my past, with the exception of HK. I'll probably should do something nice for them. Well, at least I made a mental note to that effect and entered Arya's room. My apprentice was tucked into a hospital bed and hooked up to various beeping machines. 2 banks of clear fluid and one of what looked like Bacta were fed to her intravenously. Besides that, the room was typical for a MASH. Plain grey walls and a small med droid resembling an overgrown spider hovering in the corner. What are her injuries? I asked the machine. Extreme exhaustion, heat stroke, minor internal burns. She is stable. Honestly, it was a bit better than I expected when I got the preliminary report. She would be more or less down for a couple of weeks as far as strenuous use of the Force went. Just to make sure, I went to her bed and placed my hand on her forehead, then concentrated. I carefully swept Arya's body with my power, making her flinch in her exhausted sleep. Yep, she had overdone it all right, though fortunately it wasn't nearly as bad as my stunt above Geonosis. Before leaving for Coruscant, I should make her a milder version of the alchemy concoction that hastened my own recovery. Thinking about alchemy, I got an idea. It's been quite a long time since I crafted any items, the last time my first wife was still alive, but perhaps it was time to dabble again. After all, Arya was in for a gift. You did well. I muttered, then gave the droid some instructions that would make my apprentice's recovery a bit more comfortable. Then I made my way to the Ordos. They were in an identical room, complete with a GAR medic and a med droid. Not to mention Omega guarding the entrance, though they were positioned to easily cover Arya's room as well. I hope all is well, all things considered, I asked from the door. Inside, I saw Cole hovering over protectively next to Mira, who was being scanned by the med droid. The doctor was busy checking various scrapes and abrasion on her arms. The kid obviously didn't make it easy for the Death Watch and bore the scars to prove it, including puffy and split lips and a big bruise covering almost half her face. Mandalore! Ordo straightened up and slammed his fist over his heart. General? The doctor glanced my way. Nothing we can't fix, he added. Good to know. How are you two holding up? And keep that for official events. I waved at Cole. Better than this morning. Ordo sighed. Much better, he muttered. You're late. Mira grumbled after studying me for a few seconds. I returned her stare and nodded. All the cheer and glum I saw when I met her for the first time were absent from HR eyes. She was angry, furious even, though those emotions were fragile. I could clearly feel here relief and fear behind that front. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to live up to my legend this time. Close enough for me. Cole shook his head. Not for Mira. I nodded at the kid, who was still frowning mightily. The Death Watch are done, their leadership annihilated, and their last strongholds on Concordia will be soon under assault. But that doesn't really matter to you right now, does it? I asked the kid and earned myself an angry scowl. A lot of therapy for this one, I guess, and that wasn't something I would like to undertake anyway. Not now, and not for some time, I guess, Cole added. I, however, am grateful. Those traitors got what deserved. Credit where credit's due. It was Omega Squad and my apprentice who saved the day. And Clan Ordo owes them all a debt of honor. Cole spoke with finality. That's between you and them. I nodded. What do you plan to do now? I'm asking as a clan leader. Cole glanced at the doctor and droid. If it's not classified, he added, I'm leaving to Coruscant shortly, both to negotiate an alliance with the Republic as Mandalore and answer about gaining the title while being a GAR general. Better you than me. Ordo all but shuddered at the thought of personally dealing with the Senate and Republic's bureaucracy. Beside that, I'm calling them home. I smiled. All of them. Cole gave me a speculative look. Equals RK equals. Basilic's Rest. Nar Shaddaa, the smuggler's moon. According to some, this place was Coruscant's dark twin. It was the closest place that the Hutts as a whole, and many of the galaxy's criminal cartels and organizations, had to a capital. It was a moon so built up that it resembled one giant hive of crime and villainy. It was also a great place for any mercenary to find either job, short-term lodging, or whatever gear they might need, especially if the gear was less than legal in what passed for civilized space these days. For more than 4,000 years, significant chunk of the mercenaries passing through Nar Shaddaa were of Mandalorian origin or found said culture appealing and eventually became one. In hindsight, it wasn't surprising that there were some establishments not only frequented by Mandalorians, but catering almost exclusively to their kind. The Basilic's Rest was one of the oldest and highly reputable of them, something that meant both more and less on a place like Nar Shaddaa. On a good day, at least half the clients were Mandalorian mercenaries, either just passing through, decompressing, or waiting to meet a contract. Something that had been happening in that place for hundreds of years. If you didn't know better, it would have been just another busy day. That day, there were some notable differences. First, all clients were either Mandalorians or people the patrons trusted. Second, the various holoscreen, which usually displayed many different blood sports, races, or dancing strippers from half a dozen species, were all switched on the same channel. And most importantly, all the patrons had their attention firmly fixed on the displays. As far as many of them were concerned, it's been just a week or so since the galaxy changed. It wasn't simply the war between the Republic and the CIS that got their attention, though that conflict was a big part of it. In fact, it was a catalyst. No, what got their interest and that of most Mandalorians spread through the width and breadth of the galaxy was closer to home. It has been a week since the skies above Mandalore were lit of fire by the flames of war. A week since the cradle of Mandalorian civilization was bombarded from space. More importantly, it was mere days since the most notable clan leaders gathered in Sundari and chose a new Mandalore. That by itself was novel. It was a long time since their people had a nominal leader they could respect, and Thin's Mandalore already had their attention. His name had been whispered ever since the attacks upon Coruscant. Then it was a mere novelty, a competent Republic general who knew that they still existed. The Ryloth came and made some Mandalorians take a closer look. The words of Vale's exploits were becoming more and more notable, more credible, especially when the people on Nar Shaddaa knew a lot of local captains who lost their lives and ships when they threw their lot with the CIS in an attempt to enslave more of the Twi'leks. Just a month or so ago, Geonosis changed things. It made all Mandalorian warriors worth the name stop and take a notice. That same Republic general fought and won the biggest space battle in 1,000 years. The war was escalating, and it sang to the Mandalorians' warrior hearts. Their blood ran just a bit quicker. Their hearts beat faster in anticipation. They lived to fight in a conflict such as this one, yet the weak leadership back on Mandalore wasn't going to do a thing. Satine and her ilk were pacifist of all things, and unfortunately they had too many supporters on Mandalore itself, where their people's industry was concentrated after their civil war. It was an untenable situation that made many Mandalorians put out feelers to see if either the Republic or the CIS would have work for them. It was either that or join the Death Watch and risk another civil war, something that a lot of them did anyway. Yet all that suddenly became irrelevant. The Death Watch was all but gone, extinguished within a week after they betrayed their own people to allies who saw no issue with bombarding Mandalore. To be fair, many, even most Mandalorians, haven't ever stood upon that world. It wasn't their place of origin, not their homeworld. However, it was something as important. It was a symbol, the place where their culture was born. And the Confederacy didn't think twice before unleashing their fleet upon that world. That little fact pissed off a lot of Mandalorians, even if most of them had no outlet for their anger. That was about to change. The holoscreens were busy showing images of Sundari, the most populated city hit by the orbital strikes, along with many of the smaller cities and towns. The pictures soon shifted, showing images captured during the space battle, most notable a Mandalorian battleship ramming a CIS command cruiser that was trying to escape when Republic reinforcements showed up to save the day. And didn't the very idea grate on every Mandalorian who knew the details of that battle? Whoever edited the clips was good. Below the warships tearing each other apart, everyone could see Mandalore burning. The image changed again and made everyone pay attention. 7 people stood on a small podium with Sundari's wrecked skyline in the background. They all wore customized heavy armor with their clan symbols displayed proudly. 5 of them were known clan leader, and they were flanking the other 2. Horus Yomaget was easy to recognize for anyone who paid any attention on things back on Mandalore. It couldn't be any other way, with the man having the notable distinction of being in an opposition of both Satine's government and Death Watch. With Clan Yomaget being practically the most numerous, powerful, and wealthy of them all, he could afford to do so. Next to him stood someone who only some of the older warriors recognized, Kal Skirata, and many wondered where that ancient Krathhound came from. The other clan leader were harder to place. Thang Awad, who took the leadership position after his wife died during the bombardment, wasn't a well-known entity, though he held a lot of power thanks to the industry he controlled through his clan and its allies. The big surprise was Merrick Braylor, who prior to the battle used to be one of Death Watch's biggest supporters, with both equipment and manpower. He apparently didn't appreciate Vizsla's friends bombarding his homeworld. Another lesser-known, yet important figure was the man wearing Ordo symbols. While that clan was almost extinct nowadays, the name still carried a lot of weight. That left the 2 people in the middle, the so-called negotiator, one of the more famous and effective Republic generals, and a Jedi to boot. Yet that man wore 3 symbols on his armor, those of the GAR, Mandalorian people, and a stylized winged sword. They were all familiar to the Mandalorians who had studied history and especially the old battles, which was a lot of them. It was the symbol of the Jedi of old, and it was placed where the clan sigil should be. The symbolism of it all was quite interesting, and it gave credence to some interesting rumors that General Kenobi had become a Mandalorian and married Satine Kryze of all people, just as the last figure married the Duchess' sister Bo-Katan, a former Death Watch member. Said figure wore a black armor with 2 symbols, one of Mandalore and the other a stylized wheel that was a close resemblance of the emblem of the Sith Empire. He really didn't need an introduction in among the bar's patrons. There was scarcely a being in the building who didn't know Mandalore even if this was the man's first official address, despite a few public showings caught by the media. At first glance, he didn't look like much, that new Mandalore. A bit on the short side, not particularly muscled. Short, cropped black hair and a pair of dark eyes. Average face that you wouldn't look at twice. Yet, even seeing him through the screen, the man had a presence, an aura. He commanded one's attention. Then Mandalore spoke. "It's an honor to stand once upon the soil of Mandalore. It is even bigger honor to be wearing this armor." Vale wrapped his armored knuckles over his breastplate above his heart. To be accepted as a Mandalorian, to earn the title of Mandalore, to be elected by the clans as our people's uniting voice. He trailed off and smiled grimly. Someone else in my place might say it's regrettable that this happens in an age of strife, when a wear ravages the whole galaxy. However, those wouldn't be words that anyone with the heart of a Mandalorian warrior would ever utter. For we know the truth. Being Mandalorians is the greatest of commitments, greatest of sacrifices, and that goes double for anyone who dares to claim himself a leader of Mandalorians. For a moment it seemed that Mandalore stared at the very souls of the Mandalorians watching his address. That is something the misguided fools of the Death Watch and their Confederacy masters forgot. They aimed to take power over Mandalore by the strength of arms and keep it with the numbers of the CIS droid armies. They were not true Mandalorians. They had no honor and proved it for the whole galaxy to see. Vale paused and gave a grim nod. The Death Watch already paid for their hubris, and so did their leader Pre Vizsla. The last remnants of that coward's organization still hides on Concordia and will be dealt with once and for all. Yet that leaves their masters, the people they made a deal with in order to claim Mandalore, the place where our culture originated. Mandalore shook his head in wonder. It's as if simply conquering this one world would have given them what they wanted, control over the Mandalorian people. They forgot who we are, what we are. They planned to subjugate us, to use us as expendable shock troops that should be discarded once their war was lost. A pause. The utter fools. We don't live just in this one place. He pointed at the ground below his feet. Not this world, not this system, or even this whole sector. We span the galaxy. Being Mandalorian isn't a species or a political statement. We don't have a central command that is easily decapitated. We aren't a single species or a bloodline that could be exterminated. We can rebuild our ranks with others who want to join us, others who have the same hearts as us. Mandalore raised a fist. We aren't just a mere people or an army. To be a Mandalorian is a culture, an idea, and you can't kill an idea with blades, blasters, or warships. To the Confederacy of Independent Systems that tried to subjugate us, I tell you this. You can't kill an idea, no matter how many worlds you lay to waste. Yet we can kill you. And we will. To the Confederacy leadership, you can take this as an official declaration of war between the Mandalorian people and you, a courtesy more than you deserve. Mandalore's eyes bored into the camera. To the Mandalorians living, fighting all over the galaxy, I tell you this. It is high time for you to come home. It is high time for everyone to remember us. I won't order you. I won't issue commands. I will ask you as one warrior to another, come and join me. Let us make the galaxy remember us, and our enemies tremble at the very thought of us. Mandalore smiled. I know what your hearts desire. It's the same, though, the same emotion that makes my own beat faster. There is a great war to be fought, and we will be a part of it. Even better, our honor demands that we be a part of this conflict. It cries against the madness sowed by the Confederacy. We will lead the way and write our names in the annals of history, so even in 10,000 years, we will be remembered. That's why I ask you all to come home. Bring your weapons, your ships, and let us set our enemies ablaze. =RK equals Council Chambers, Jedi Temple, Coruscant. The large circular room was all but empty. Only a single tiny being sat in one of the chairs, placed in a circle around an open space in its center. The Grand Master of the Jedi Order watched the end of Mandalore's address, and his ears drooped in regret. It wasn't because Vale had betrayed the Republic, no matter what many would be screaming, and soon. Not yet, at least, but because it didn't matter. That man had his reasons for such a controversial choice. They might have even been good enough. It didn't matter. Yoda already felt the Force trembling. More and more Jedi were seeing the same transmission. The conservatives and many of the neutrals would see Vale becoming Mandalore as nothing more than a typical Sith power grab. And Yoda wasn't sure how much of such conclusion would be an overreaction. The one thing he knew was that the friendly Sith had seen an opportunity and grabbed it. The consequences, however, did the man think about them, and if he did he care? Yoda closed his eyes, sighed and slumped in his chair. He could sense the turmoil in the temple itself. Some Jedi were confused, others would probably wait for more information before they made up their mind. Yet too many were scared and angry. He had to be ready to fend of the conservatives and try finding a middle ground. Because the alternative was unthinkable, the way things were going ultimately, it wouldn't matter who won the war or if Vale was going to show his true intentions. The Order was splintering, slowly tearing apart under the strain of multiple factions, and Yoda wasn't sure how to fix it.